It is a truth universally acknowledged by the weary hands that hold the pen, that the parts of a story which cost the author the most profound and agonizing labor are often the very same that the reader skims with a restless eye or passes over with a muted sigh, like a father who has mortgaged his soul to provide a feast only to watch his guests pick indifferently at the most succulent dishes. I must confess that these initial essays, these ornate gilded gateways prefixed to the historical matter of every book, have been my most demanding children. They are the progeny of sleepless nights and furrowed brows, and I have determined them to be the essential beating heart of this particular brand of writing a genre. I have, perhaps audaciously, placed myself at the helm of. For this determination, I feel no more obligation to provide a detailed justification than a monarch feels to explain his coronation to the commoners. It is a rule laid down by the sovereign of this narrative realm, and that is reason enough. Consider the established dogmas of the stage. Who now dares to question the sacred unity of time and place that rigid cage for the wild spirit of drama? What earnest soul has ever stood in the pit and demanded of a critic, why can a play not span two sunsets as easily as one? Why can my imagination, a vessel that travels without the burden of tolls or tired horses, not be whisked 50 miles across the countryside with the same ease as 5? The ancient critics erected these walls, and we, like sheep, have grown accustomed to the pen. We have embraced the legal maxim times, cuicunque in arte sua perito credendum est. Times one must trust the expert in his own art. We assume in our collective innocence that such men could not possibly be so brazen, so utterly brazen, as to dictate laws without a foundation of pure, unadulterated reason lying just beneath the surface, invisible to our unfortunate shallow gaze. Asterisk. But pause here for a moment, and if you find your intellect intrigued by this rebellion against stale rules, do us the great honor of leaving a comment with your own thoughts on the tyranny of critics. Asterisk. Alas, the truth is far more pedestrian. The world, in its generous folly, has paid critics a compliment so vast it borders on the absurd, clothing them in the borrowed robes of a profundity they do not possess. Flattered by this deference, these humble clerks have staged a bloodless coup. They have seized the dictatorial throne, and now, with astonishing assurance, dispense laws to the very authors from whose brilliant predecessors they originally transcribed the rules. Imagine a scribe, his fingers stained with ink, suddenly declaring himself king and imposing taxes on the royal lineage that employed him. This is the state of our letters. The critic, in his pure, intended form, was never meant to be more than a clerk, a diligent recorder of the laws laid down by the true legislators, the great authors whose colossal genius illuminated the path. The old critics knew their place. They dared not utter a sentence without propping it up with the formidable authority of a Homer or a Virgil. But time, the great eroder of all things, and ignorance, its dim-witted accomplice, saw the clerk's ambition stir. Slowly he began to invade the power and assume the dignity of his master. The living, breathing practice of the author was chained and replaced by the dead, dry dictates of the critic. The transcriber became the legislator, and he who was once tasked with copying the map now presumes to dictate the very contours of the earth itself. From this grand inflation of ego arose an error as obvious as it was perhaps unavoidable. These critics, being men of shallow capacities, easily mistook the hollow shell of form for the vibrant substance within. They are like a judge who, in a case of life and death, adheres with bone-dry rigidity to the lifeless letter of the law, while the glorious humane spirit of it withers and dies in the dock. A trivial turn of phrase, perhaps a mere accident of style in a great author, was seized upon by these critics, enshrined as his chief merit, and transmitted as holy writ to all who followed. Asterisk, asterisk. And while we are on the subject of transmitting worthy things, please do consider sharing this narrative with a fellow lover of stories, that our community may grow. Asterisk, asterisk. To these intellectual encroachments, time and ignorance, the twin pillars upholding every imposture in history lent their formidable authority. Thus many rules for good writing were established rules that have not the faintest root in the rich soil of truth or nature. Their sole purpose is to curb and restrain genius, as if one would demand a dancing master to perform his most graceful minuet while shackled in iron chains. Therefore, to avoid any imputation of being just another dogmatic voice, laying down rules for posterity based on nothing but my own times, ipse dixit times, for which I confess I hold a veneration so profound, it is non-existent. I shall here waive my privileged autocracy. I shall lay bare before you, dear reader, the true reason for sowing these digressive essays throughout the fertile field of my narrative. In doing so, we shall of necessity break new ground, opening a vein of knowledge which, if it has been glimpsed by others, has not, to my recollection, been mined by any ancient or modern writer. This vein is the rich lode of time's contrast asterisk. It is a thread of gold and shadow that runs through the entire tapestry of creation, and it holds a mighty share in forming our very idea of beauty, both in nature and in art. For how do we know the brilliance of light, if not for the existence of darkness? What demonstrates the exquisite beauty and excellence of a thing, if not its reverse? The languid golden beauty of a summer's day is given its value by the biting, skeletal horror of a winter's night. I truly believe that if a man were to have known only the two former, his idea of their beauty would be pitifully imperfect, like a man who has only ever tasted sugar and thus knows nothing of its sweetness. But to leaven this philosophical dough with a more social yeast, can there be any doubt that the finest woman in the world would see her charms rendered meaningless in the eye of a man who had never beheld a woman of a different caste? The ladies themselves are so acutely sensible of this truth that they become industrious architects of their own foils. Nay, they will even become their own opposition. For I have observed at Bath, particularly the studied art with which they present themselves as dreadfully as possible in the merciless light of morning, all to make the beauty they unveil in the candle-lit evening appear not merely imperfect, improved, but nothing short of a divine revelation. This secret is known intuitively by most artists, even if they have not troubled to dissect its theory. The jeweler with his velvet cloth and dark settings knows the finest, brilliant diamond requires a foil to truly capture the light and the heart. The painter, through the clever contrast of his figures, the dark against the light, the robust against the delicate, often snatches his greatest applause. A great genius of our own age and nation will illustrate this matter with unparalleled clarity. I cannot, in good conscience, place him under the common heading of artists, for he deserves a loftier title. Walking among those times, inventus qui vitam excoluere per artis times, who by invented arts have life improved. I speak of the ingenious inventor of that most exquisite of English entertainments, the pantomime. This singular spectacle was composed of two distinct parts, which the inventor wisely distinguished by the names of the Times, Serious Times, and the Times Comic Asterisk. The serious part paraded before the audience a certain number of heathen gods and heroes who were without question the most tedious and insufferable company into which any paying audience was ever compelled. These figures, a secret known only to the cognoscenti, were times intended, times to be so profoundly dull, their purpose being to act as a deep grey backdrop against which the comic antics of Harlequin could sparkle with multiplied vigour. This was perhaps a rather impious use to which to put such esteemed personages from mythology, but the contrivance was nevertheless devilishly ingenious. Its effect becomes crystal clear if, in our minds, we replace the words serious and comic with duller and dullest. For the comic was certainly duller than anything else previously shown on the stage, and could only be made palatable by that superlative monumental degree of dullness which composed the serious. So intolerably solemn, so leaden-footed were these gods and heroes that the entrance of Harlequin, though let it be known, the English gentleman of that name is of a much more serious disposition than his flighty French cousin, was always a moment of profound relief, a liberation of the audience from company that was quite simply worse. Judicious writers have, since time immemorial, practiced this art of contrast with spectacular success. I have often been surprised that the poet Horace should cavil at Homer for occasionally nodding, but the man contradicts himself in the very next breath of his verse. He writes, "I grieve if e'er great Homer chance to sleep, yet slumbers on long works have right to creep." We must not be so literal as to believe the author actually falls asleep at his desk. It is true the readers are often thus overtaken, but if the work is as long-winded as those of a writer like Old Mixon, the author himself is far too entertained by the sound of his own voice to feel the least hint of drowsiness. He is, as Mr. Pope so wickedly observed, sleepless himself to give his readers sleep. To speak the plain truth, these soporific parts are so many scenes of times, serious times, artfully interwoven into the narrative, their purpose being to contrast and set off the vibrant living parts. This is the true hidden meaning of that facetious writer who once told his public with a wink that whenever they found him dull, they could be assured it was by design. It is in this light then, or rather in this carefully constructed darkness, that I would have you, my discerning reader, consider these initial essays. They are the solemn gods and heroes of my pantomime. And after this lengthy but necessary warning, if you are of the opinion that you can find enough of the times, serious times in the other more active parts of this history, you are hereby granted full and free license to skip these passages, where I profess to have been laboriously, intentionally dull. You may, with my blessing, begin the following books at the second chapter, and may fortune guide your path. The confines of a sick room, as many a convalescent can attest, become a peculiar theatre, where the characters of visitors are magnified and revealed in the most unsparing light. During his imprisonment of flesh and bone, Tom Jones played host to a parade of such visitors, though the company of some was as welcome as a draught of cold medicine. Mr. Allworthy, the very pillar of his world, was his most faithful attendant, appearing almost daily. His heart, a deep well of compassion, truly ached for the youth's sufferings, and he privately glowed with a grim approval at the gallant, if reckless, behavior that had occasioned them. Yet in the wise and perhaps opportunistic calculus of a guardian, he perceived this season of pain as a fertile ground for sowing the seeds of reformation. He believed that wholesome advice, like a surgeon's lance, could never be applied at a more propitious season than when the mind is softened by the feverish sweat of agony, humbled by the vulnerability of the body, and stripped of the turbulent passions that usually drive a young man headlong toward folly. Therefore, in those quiet hours when the good man was alone with his recuperating charge, especially when the pain had subsided into a dull throb and Tom was at his most placid, he would gently, so gently steer the conversation toward the safe and rocky shores of the young man's past miscarriages. He did so not to scourge the boy with memory, but in the mildest and tenderest manner, using these recollections as a preface to the caution he prescribed for future conduct, on which alone he assured him his voice, a low, earnest hum of conviction, would depend his own felicity and the kindness which he might yet promise himself to receive at my hands, unless that is you should hereafter forfeit my good opinion. For as to what has passed, he said with a wave of his hand that seemed to brush the past aside, it shall be all forgiven and forgotten. Heed this advice, my boy, make a good use of this accident. Let it be a visitation, not a punishment, and in the end it may prove the most fortunate event of your life for the grounding of your character. The Reverend Mr. Thwackum was another assiduous, if less welcome, presence at the sickbed. He too considered the prone and captive form of a patient to be a conveniently staged scene for his moral lectures. His style, however, lacked all the balm of Allworthy's tenderness. It was pure vinegar. He told his pupil, his eyes gleaming with a kind of grim satisfaction, that he ought to look on his broken limb as a judgment from heaven, a direct and personal rebuke for his sins, that it would become him to be daily on his knees, not merely praying for healing, but pouring forth fervent thanksgivings that he had broken his arm only and not his neck. This latter catastrophe, he added, was very probably reserved for some future occasion, and that perhaps not very remote. Leaning in closer his breath, a whisper of condemnation, he confessed, "For my part, I have often wondered some more severe judgment had not overtaken him before, but it may be perceived by this, that divine punishments, though they may seem to tarry, are always sure. From this bleak premise he advised Tom to foresee with equal certainty the greater evils which were yet behind, and which were as sure as this of overtaking him in his current state of reprobacy. These are he intoned to be averted only by such a thorough and sincere repentance as is not to be expected or hoped for from one so abandoned in his youth, and whose mind, I am afraid, is totally corrupted. It is my duty, however, to exhort you to this repentance, though I too well know all my exhortations will be as vain and fruitless as seeds cast upon stone. But times liberavi animam meum, times my conscience is clear of neglect, though it is with the utmost concern that I see you travelling on with wilful speed towards certain misery in this world, and to as certain damnation in the next. It is in these moments of profound conflict that a story truly captivates the soul. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the hearts of these characters, please take a second to like this chapter, In a radically different strain spoke Mr. Square. He dismissed such mundane events as a broken bone as being far beneath the consideration of a truly wise man. It is abundantly sufficient to reconcile the mind to any of these petty mischances. He would declare striking a philosophical pose to reflect that they are liable to befall the wisest and most virtuous of mankind, and are undoubtedly in the grand scheme of Providence for the good of the whole. He said, "It is a mere abuse of words, a vulgar error, to call those things evils in which there is no trace of moral unfitness. That pain," he asserted, "which is the worst consequence of such accidents, is in fact the most contemptible thing in the world, a mere phantom of the senses that the disciplined mind can utterly transcend." He had more of these lofty sentences, extracted wholesale from the second book of Tully's Tusculan Questions and the elegant writings of the great Lord Shaftesbury. One day, in pronouncing these doctrines with particular fervour, he grew so eager that he unfortunately brought his teeth down upon his own tongue with a sharp, sickening nip. The pain was so acute and sudden that it not only put an immediate end to his discourse, but caused his face to contort and forced him to mutter an oath or two most unbecoming of a philosopher. Worst of all, this accident provided Thwackum, who was present and held all such Stoic doctrine to be heathenish and atheistical, a golden opportunity to clap a judgment upon his back. See, Thwackum sneered with malicious triumph. The judgment of heaven for such blasphemous talk. This sneer, so venomous and smug, totally unhinged the temper of the philosopher, which the bite had already ruffled. Had not the surgeon, who was luckily in the room, interposed and preserved the peace, contrary to his own interest, which would have profited from another patient Square, disabled from venting his wrath with his lips, might have found a far more violent and physical method of revenging himself upon the parson. Mr. Bliffle, that worthy youth, visited his friend Jones, but seldom and never without a chaperone, as if the very air of the sick room were contagious. He professed with a face of carved marble much regard for Tom, and great concern at his misfortune. Yet he cautiously avoided any true intimacy or private conversation, lest, as he frequently hinted to others, it might contaminate the sobriety of my own character. For this purpose, he had constantly upon his lips that proverb in which Solomon speaks, against evil communication. He was not so openly bitter as Thwackum. His poison was distilled into drops of faux hope. He always expressed a slender thread of belief in Tom's possible reformation, which he would say the unparalleled goodness shown by my uncle on this occasion must certainly affect in one not absolutely abandoned. He always concluded, however, with a subtle knife twist. But if Mr. Jones ever offends hereafter, I shall not be able to say a single syllable in his favor. It was a sentence of conditional friendship, with the condition being perfection itself. As for Squire Western, he was a tidal force of nature in the sick room, seldom out of it, unless he was galloping after a fox or drowning his concerns in his bottle. Nay, he would sometimes retire to Tom's chamber to take his beer in boisterous companionship, and it was only with the greatest difficulty that he was prevented from forcing Jones to partake of his own rustic panacea. The clash of worldviews at Tom's bedside is a fascinating study of human nature. What do you think is the most flawed philosophy? Share your thoughts in a comment below. This boisterous behavior, as it meant no harm, so happily it affected none. Indeed, it was all abundantly compensated to Jones as soon as he was able to sit up, for then the squire would bring his daughter Sophia to visit. Nor was it long before Jones was able to attend her to the harpsichord, where she would kindly condescend for hours together to charm the very soul within him with the most delicious music. The notes were not just sounds, but visible, shimmering things that seemed to cleanse the air of pain, only to be interrupted when the squire thought proper to insist on Old Sir Simon or some other favourite hunting tune. Notwithstanding the nicest guard which Sophia endeavoured to set on her behaviour, love is a cunning prisoner that will find a vent. When it is denied expression in one part, it will certainly break out in another. What her lips therefore concealed, her eyes, those beautiful betraying windows, her blushes, and 1,000 little involuntary actions of her hand, or a sigh, clearly revealed to any observer keen enough to look. One day a pivotal scene unfolded. Sophia was at the harpsichord, and Jones was attending with rapt attention when the squire burst into the room, his face flushed with partisan fury. "There, Tom," he cried, "I have had a battle for thee below stairs, with that thick parson Thwackum. He hath been telling Allworthy before my very face that the broken bone was a judgment upon thee. Din, it says. Aye, how can that be? Did he not come by it in defence of a young woman? A judgment indeed. Pox! If he never doth anything worse, he will go to heaven sooner than all the parsons in the country. He hath more reason to glory in it than to be ashamed of it." "Indeed, sir," says Jones, his gaze flickering almost imperceptibly toward Sophia, "I have no reason for either pride or shame, but if it preserved Miss Western, I shall always think it the happiest accident of my life." And to go the squire stormed on to set Allworthy against thee for it. D-n him, if the parson had on his petticoats, I should have lent him a flick, for I love thee dearly, my boy. And D-n me, if there is anything in my power which I won't do for thee. Shat take thy choice of all the horses in my stable tomorrow morning, except only the Chevalier and Miss Slouch." Jones thanked him, but declined his mind far from equine thoughts. "Nay," added the squire, not to be refused, "Shat ha the sorrel mare that Sophie rode. She cost me 50 guineas, and comes 6 years old this grass. At this, a passionate fire ignited in Jones's eyes. "If she had cost me 1,000, he cried with a vehemence that startled the room, "I would have given her to the dogs." "Pooh-pooh," answered Western. "What because she broke thy arm, shouldst forget and forgive? I thought hadst been more a man than to bear malice against a dumb creature." Here Sophia, whose countenance had undergone more than one subtle change during these speeches, swiftly interposed. She had imputed Tom's passionate resentment to a motive far different from her father's simple deduction. She believed it was for her time's sake, for the terror and danger she had been in, that he hated the beast. Her spirits were now in a visible flutter, and she played so intolerably ill that had not Western soon fallen into a sudden snoring sleep, he must have remarked it. Jones, however, who was fully awake and in possession of all his senses, made these observations. These fresh clues, joined to all the little looks and blushes the reader may remember from former times, gave him, when he came to reflect on the whole, the most pretty and strong assurances that all was not merely well, but wonderfully and tumultuously alive in the tender bosom of Sophia. This realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, occasioning a perturbation in his mind, which in a constitution less pure and firm than his might have led to a dangerous relapse. He was now truly and fully sensible of the great worth of Sophia. He extremely liked her enchanting person, no less admired her refined accomplishments, and tenderly loved her innate goodness. In reality, as he had never once dared to entertain a conscious thought of possessing her, nor had ever given the least voluntary indulgence to his inclinations, he had been nurturing a much stronger passion for her than he himself had been acquainted with. His heart in this moment of clarity brought forth the full, dazzling secret into the light of his understanding, and at the very same time, with a leap of impossible hope, it assured him that the adorable object of all this affection might return it. The reader, comfortably ensconced in their chair and far from the feverish tumult of a young man's heart, might imagine that the sensations which now arose in Jones were so unadulterately sweet and delicious that they would naturally produce a cheerful serenity, a blissful calm. One might think this revelation of reciprocated affection would be a balm soothing the pains of his body and the anxieties of his mind, but the truth of such passions is far more complex and violent. In fact, sensations of this kind, however rapturous, are at their first dizzying recognition profoundly tumultuous. They contain very little of the peaceful opiate and much more of the thrilling, terrifying lightning strike. They jolt the soul awake, only to leave it trembling in the aftermath. Moreover, in Jones's present case, these sweeter feelings were poisoned and embittered by certain harsh circumstances, which, when mixed with the intoxicating ingredients of hope, composed a draught that could only be termed bitter sweet. And just as nothing is more disagreeable to the physical palate, so nothing in the metaphorical sense can be so injurious to the peace of the mind. It is a conflict where every gain is also a loss, and every hope is shadowed by a fear. For first, though he had what seemed a sufficient foundation to flatter himself based on the blushes, the glances, the faltering music of Sophia, He was not yet free from the gnawing doubt that he might be tragically misconstruing simple compassion, or at best, a gentle and patronizing esteem into a far warmer and more personal regard. He was far from possessing a sanguine assurance that Sophia cherished any such affection for him as might promise his own wild burgeoning inclinations that ultimate harvest which, if they were encouraged and lovingly nursed, they would finally grow up to require. His love was a full-grown oak, but did her heart contain even a sapling? Besides, even if he could dare to hope, he would find no bar to his happiness from the daughter. He thought himself certain of meeting an insurmountable, effectual bar in the person of the father. Squire Western, though he was a country squire in his bawdy diversions and rustic manners, was perfectly a man of the world. In whatever regarded his fortune, he possessed the most violent and possessive affection for his only daughter, and had often signified in the unguarded truth-telling of his cups the profound pleasure he proposed in seeing her married to one of the richest men in the Truth County. Jones was not so vain and senseless a coxcomb as to expect that from any rough regard which Western had professed for him, he would ever be induced to lay aside these ambitious views of advancing his daughter. He well knew the cold calculus of the world, that fortune is generally the principal, if not the sole consideration which operates on the best of parents in these matters. For friendship may make us warmly espouse the interests of others, but it is very cold to the gratification of their passions. Indeed, to feel the happiness which may result from this, it is necessary we should possess the passion ourselves. The torment of a divided heart is a universal agony. If you've ever faced an impossible choice between love and duty, we invite you to share this moment of the story with someone who would understand. As he had therefore no solid hopes of obtaining her father's consent, the only alternative was to endeavor to succeed without it. But the very idea of such an endeavor to elope with Sophia to frustrate the great point of Mr. Weston's life was to make a most vile and ill use of the squire's boisterous hospitality. It would be a deeply ungrateful return to the many little favors, however roughly bestowed, he had received at his hands. If he viewed such a consequence with horror and disdain, how much more was he shocked by what it meant for Mr. Allworthy, to whom as he had more than filial obligations, so he held for him more than filial piety. He knew the noble nature of that good man to be so averse to any baseness or treachery that the least attempt of such a kind would make the sight of the guilty person forever odious to his eyes, and the very name, Jones, a detestable sound in his ears. The appearance of these unsurmountable difficulties was sufficient to have inspired him with despair, however ardent his wishes had been. But even these wishes were now cruelly controlled by a surge of compassion for another woman. The idea of the lovely, vulnerable Molly now intruded itself before him, a ghost at the feast of his newfound love. He had sworn eternal constancy in her arms, and she had as often vowed with the desperate passion of the doomed, never to outlive his deserting her. He now saw her in all the most shocking postures of death, her lifeless form a terrible accusation against his name. Nay, he considered all the subsequent miseries of prostitution and social ruin to which she would be inevitably liable, and of which he would be doubly the occasion, first by seducing her and then by coldly deserting her. For he well knew the seething hatred which all her neighbors and even her own sisters bore her, and how ready they would all be to tear her to pieces with their scorn. Indeed, he had exposed her to more envy than shame, or rather to the latter, by means of the former, for many women who now abused her for being a whore were secretly envying her handsome lover, and her fine ribbons, and would have been themselves glad to have purchased such trinkets and attentions at the same price. The ruin, therefore, of the poor girl must, he foresaw, unavoidably attend his deserting her, and this thought stung him to the very soul. Poverty and distress seemed to him to give none a right of aggravating those misfortunes. The meanness of her condition did not represent her misery as of little consequence in his eyes, nor did it appear to justify or even to palliate his own guilt in bringing that misery upon her. But why do I mention justification? His own good heart would not suffer him to destroy a human creature who he sincerely thought loved him, and had to that love sacrificed her innocence. His own heart pleaded her cause, not as a cold venal advocate, but as one intimately interested in the event, and which must itself deeply share in all the agonies its owner brought upon another. When this powerful internal advocate had sufficiently raised the pity of Jones, painting poor Molly in all the heart-rending circumstances of her potential wretchedness, it artfully called in the assistance of another passion, memory, and desire. It then represented the girl in all the amiable colors of her youth, her vibrant health, and her rustic beauty. It recalled her as one greatly the object of desire, and much more so, at least, to a good mind from being at the very same time the object of profound compassion. Amidst this civil war of thoughts and passions, poor Jones passed the long and sleepless night, tossing in a bed that felt like a bed of thorns. When the grey morning light finally crept into his room, the weary result of the whole internal debate was a grim, virtuous resolution to abide by Molly, to honor his first commitment, and to drive the enchanting, impossible image of Sophia from his thoughts forever. In this stern and self-sacrificing resolution, he continued all the next day till the evening, consciously cherishing the idea of Molly and forcefully repressing any thought of Sophia. But in the fatal evening, a very trifling, almost absurd accident, as is so often the case in human affairs, set all his passions again afloat, and worked so total a change in his mind that we think it decent to communicate this dramatic reversal in a fresh chapter. Among the stream of well-wishers who paid their respects to the young gentleman in his confinement was the ever-significant Mrs. Honor. The astute reader, upon reflecting on certain pointed expressions which have formerly slipped from her lips, might well conceive that she herself harbored a very particular and personal affection for Mr. Jones, but in reality such a notion could not be further from the truth. Tom was indisputably a handsome young fellow, and for that particular species of mankind, Mrs. Honor certainly possessed a general regard. Yet this regard was perfectly indiscriminate, a mere appreciation of a pleasing form, for having been cruelly crossed in the grand passion she had borne for a certain nobleman's footman, a serpent who had basely deserted her. After the most solemn promise of marriage, she had so securely stitched together the broken remnants of her heart that no man since had been able to possess himself of so much as a single fragment. She now viewed all handsome men with that equal platonic regard and benevolent goodwill which a sober and virtuous mind bears towards all the good things of creation. One might indeed call her a lover of men in the same lofty sense that Socrates was a lover of mankind, perhaps preferring one to another for corporeal attributes, as he did for mental qualifications, but never carrying this preference so far as to cause the slightest perturbation in the philosophical serenity of her temper. The day after Mr. Jones had endured that violent conflict with himself which we have detailed in the preceding chapter, Mrs. Honor sailed into his room. Finding him alone and pensive, she began in her characteristically coy and self-important manner. "La, sir, wherever do you think I have been? I warrants you, you would not guess in 50 years. But then, if you did guess, to be sure, I must not tell you neither. It is a secret, you see. Nay, if it be something which you must not tell me," said Jones, a flicker of curiosity cutting through his melancholy, "then you only sharpen my appetite to know. I shall have the utmost curiosity to inquire, and I know you are not so barbarous as to refuse me." "I don't know," cried she, affecting a thoughtful pause, "why I should refuse you neither for that matter, for to be sure you are a gentleman and won't mention it any more, and for that matter if you knew where I have been, unless you knew what I have been about, it would not signify much. Nay, upon my honor, I don't see why it should be kept a secret for my part, for to be sure she is the best lady in the world, and that is the truth of it." Upon this, Jones began to beg earnestly to be let into this secret, his faithful promises not to divulge it falling from his lips like a solemn vow. Thus prevailed upon, she proceeded thus: "Why, you must know, sir, my young lady sent me on a particular errand she did to inquire after that Molly Seagrim, and to see whether the wench wanted for anything. To be sure, I did not care to go, methinks. It is not a fit place for a lady's maid, but servants must do what they are ordered. Must we not? How could you undervalue yourself so, Mr. Jones, to be tangled with such common goods? So my lady bid me go and carry her some linen and other small comforts. She is too good, I tell you. If such forward sluts were sent to Bridewell, it would be the better for them and for all honest folk. I told my lady, says I, madam, your lordship is encouraging idleness and vice. That's what I said. And was my Sophia so good, says Jones, his heart leaping at the mere mention of her charity. My Sophia, I assure you, marry, come up, answered Honor, with a toss of her head. And yet, if you knew all indeed, if I was in the place of Mr. Jones, I should look a little higher than such trumpery as Molly Seagrim. There are finer birds in the air, sir. What do you mean by these words? Replied Jones, seizing on her hint. If I knew all I mean, what I mean says, Honor, savouring the power of her hidden knowledge. Don't you remember putting your hands in my lady's muff once to warm them, a bold liberty that was, I vow I could almost find in my heart to tell you more if I was only certain my lady would never come to the hearing on't. Jones then made several solemn, desperate protestations of his secrecy, and Honor, thus fortified, proceeded. Then to be sure you must know that my lady had given that very muff to me as a present. But about a day or two after I had told her the story of your impertinence, then you told her what I had done," interrupted Jones, his face a mixture of horror and hope. "If I did, sir," answered she with an air of injured innocence, "you need not be angry with me. Many's the man would have given his head to have had my lady told of such an attention if they had but known for. To be sure, the biggest lord in the land might be proud, but I protest, I have a great mind not to tell you another word." Jones fell to fresh entreaties, and soon prevailed upon her to go on. "You must know then, sir, that my lady had given this muff to me, but about a day or two later, she suddenly quarrels with her new muff, and to be sure it is the prettiest that ever was seen. 'Honor,' says she, 'this is an odious muff. It is too big for me. I can't wear it till I can get another. You must let me have my old one again, and you may have this in the room, aunt, for she's a good lady and scorns to give a thing and take a thing back, I promise you that. So to be sure, I fetched it her back again, and I believe she hath worn it upon her arm almost ever since, and I warrants hath given it many a secret kiss when nobody hath seen her. This single whispered confession would change the course of 2 lives forever. If your own heart is beating a little faster, why not subscribe to follow every twist of this timeless romance?" Here the conversation was abruptly interrupted by the booming voice of Mr. Western himself, who came to summon Jones to the harpsichord. The poor young fellow went his face, having drained of all color, his limbs trembling with the revelation. Western observed this pallor and tremor, but upon seeing Mrs. Honor hastily composing herself, he imputed it to a wholly wrong cause, and having given Jones a hearty curse suspended somewhere between jest and earnest, he bid him beat abroad and not poach up the game in his warren, a rustic metaphor that needed no translation. Sophia looked this evening with more than her usual radiant beauty. Yet we may believe it was no small addition to her charms in the utterly captivated eye of Mr. Jones that she now happened to have perched upon her right arm this very muff, the silent witness to their shared secret. It was as if she carried a piece of their stolen intimacy in plain sight. She was playing one of her father's favorite tunes, and he was leaning on her chair, lost in the music and her proximity, when the muff, perhaps by fate or a nervous tremor of her own, slipped and fell over her fingers, jarring her from the melody and putting her out. This so disconcerted the squire, whose appreciation for music was as delicate as his hunting cries, that he snatched the offending muff from her and with a hearty curse threw it directly into the fire. In an instant Sophia was on her feet, all composure lost, and with the utmost desperate eagerness she plunged her hand into the flames to recover it, scorching her delicate fingers without a second thought. Though this incident will probably appear of little consequence to many of our readers, a mere trifle of no import, yet trifling as it was, it had so violent an effect on the heart of poor Jones that we thought it our duty to relate it with precision. In reality, there are many of these little circumstances too often omitted by injudicious historians, from which events of the utmost importance arise. The world may indeed be considered as a vast and complex machine, in which the great wheels of destiny are originally set in motion by those which are very minute and almost imperceptible to any but the strongest and most discerning eyes. Thus, not all the accumulated charms of the incomparable Sophia not all the dazzling brightness and languishing softness of her eyes, the perfect harmony of her voice and of her person, not all her wit, her good humor, her greatness of mind, or her sweetness of disposition had been able so absolutely to conquer and enslave the heart of poor Jones as this one little desperate incident of the muff. It was a confession more eloquent than any sonnet, a pledge more binding than any vow. Thus the poet sweetly sings of Troy, how captique dolus lacrimis quocti, quos neque tedides nec Lariseus Achilles, non anni domuere decem non mille carinae. What Diomede or Thetis's greater son 1,000 ships nor 10 years' siege had done? False tears and fawning words the city won. The citadel of Jones's heart was now taken by surprise. All those formidable considerations of honor and prudence which our hero had lately with so much military wisdom placed as sentries and guards over the avenues of his heart ran away from their posts in a disorderly rout, and the god of sane love marched in full and triumphant glory. But though this victorious deity love had with a single dazzling charge easily expelled his avowed enemies, honor and prudence, from the heart of Jones, he found it a far more delicate and difficult operation to supplant the garrison which he himself, in an earlier, more reckless campaign, had placed there, to lay aside all allegory which can often obscure the raw truth of human feeling. The concern for what must become of poor Molly greatly disturbed and perplexed the mind of the worthy youth. The superior celestial merit of Sophia had totally eclipsed, or rather extinguished, all the rustic beauties of the poor girl. But in the place of passionate love, a profound and aching compassion had succeeded. It was a sentiment no less powerful in its own way for being born of pity rather than desire. He was convinced with the crushing certainty of a man reviewing his own promises that the girl had placed all her affections and her entire prospect of future happiness in him alone. For this conviction he knew he had given more than sufficient occasion by the utmost profusion of tenderness towards her, a tenderness which he had taken every possible means to persuade her he would always maintain. She, on her side, had assured him of her firm, unshakable belief in his promise, and had, with the most solemn and desperate vows, declared that on his fulfilling or breaking these promises it depended whether she should be the happiest or the most miserable of womankind. And to be the author of this highest, most abject degree of misery to a human being who had trusted him so completely was a thought on which he could not bear to ruminate for a single moment. It was a moral abyss that threatened to swallow him whole. He considered this poor girl as having sacrificed to him everything in her little power, as having been at her own expense the sole object of his pleasure, as sighing and languishing for him, even at that very instant. Shall then, says he, to the four walls of his room my recovery, for which she hath so ardently wished, shall my presence, which she hath so eagerly expected, instead of giving her that transport of joy with which she hath flattered herself, cast her at once down into the bottomless pit of misery and despair? Can I be such a villain? What kind of monster would that make me? Here, just as the genius of poor Molly seemed to be triumphing in his conscience, the image of Sophia's love for him, which now appeared no longer a dubious fantasy, but a tangible reality, rushed upon his mind with the force of a tidal wave and bore away every obstacle, every scruple before it. At length, after much agonized pacing, it occurred to him that he might possibly be able to make Molly amends another way, namely by giving her a sum of money. This, nevertheless, he almost despaired of her accepting when he recollected the frequent and vehement assurances he had received from her that the whole world put in balance with him would make her no amends for his loss. However, her extreme poverty, and chiefly her egregious vanity, somewhat of which hath been already hinted to the reader, gave him a sliver of hope that notwithstanding all her avowed tenderness, she might in time be brought to content herself with a fortune superior to her expectation, and which might indulge her vanity by setting her above all her equals in the parish. He resolved, therefore, to take the first opportunity of making a proposal of this kind, steeling his heart for the unpleasant task. One day, accordingly, when his arm was so well recovered that he could walk easily with it slung in a silken sash, he stole forth at a season when the squire was engaged in his violent field exercises, and ventured to visit his fair one. Her mother and sisters, whom he found taking their tea in the cramped, smoky main room, informed him first with blank faces that Molly was not at home, but afterwards the elder sister Bridget acquainted him with a malicious smile that did not reach her cold eyes that she was above stairs abed. Tom, suspecting no deeper game, had no objection to this situation of his mistress, and immediately ascended the rickety ladder which led towards her bedchamber. But when he came to the top, he, to his great surprise, found the door fast, nor could he for some time obtain any answer from within, for Molly, as she herself afterwards informed him, was fast asleep, lost to the world and its complications. The extremes of grief and joy have been remarked by poets and philosophers to produce very similar effects upon the human countenance and spirit, and when either of these powerful emotions rushes on us by surprise, it is apt to create such a total perturbation and confusion that we are often thereby deprived of the use of all our faculties. It cannot therefore be wondered at that the unexpected sight of Mr. Jones should so strongly operate on the mind of Molly, and should overwhelm her with such confusion that for some minutes she was unable to express the great raptures with which the reader will suppose she was affected on this occasion. Her heart was a battlefield of shock, guilt, and a residual affection. As for Jones, he was so entirely possessed and, as it were, enchanted by the presence of his beloved object, and by the sheer relief of unburdening his conscience, that he for a while forgot the magnificent Sophia, and consequently the principal, painful purpose of his visit. This, however, soon recurred to his memory with the sharpness of a cold blade, and after the first transports of their meeting were over, he found means by degrees to introduce a discourse on the fatal consequences which must attend their amour, if Mr. Allworthy, who had strictly forbidden him ever seeing her more, should discover that he still carried on this commerce. Such a discovery, which his enemies gave him reason to think would be unavoidable, must, he said, end in his utter ruin, and consequently in hers, for she would lose his protection entirely. Since, therefore, their hard fates had determined that they must separate, he advised her to bear it with resolution, and swore he would never omit any opportunity through the course of his life, of showing her the sincerity of his affection by providing for her in a manner beyond her utmost expectation, or even beyond her wishes, if ever that should be in his power, concluding at last with a clumsy but well-intentioned hope that she might soon find some good man who would marry her, and who would make her much happier than she could be by leading a disreputable life with him. Molly remained a few moments in silence, absorbing this blow, and then bursting into a flood of tears, she began to upbraid him in the following words: "And this is your love, for me to forsake me in this manner. Now you have ruined me. How often, when I have told you that all men are false and perjury alike, and grow tired of us as soon as ever they have had their wicked wills of us, how often have you sworn you would never forsake me? And can you be such a perjury man? After all, what signifies all the riches in the world to me without you? Now you have gained my heart, so you have. Why do you mention another man to me? I can never love any other man as long as I live. All other men are nothing to me. If the greatest squire in all the country would come a-suiting to me tomorrow, I would not give my company to him. No, I shall always hate and despise the whole sex for your sake." She was proceeding thus, her voice rising in a familiar lament, when an accident of the most farcical and humiliating nature put a stop to her tongue before it had run out half its career. The room, or rather garret, in which Molly lay being up one pair of stairs, that is to say, at the very top of the house, was of a sloping figure resembling the great delta of the Greeks. The English reader may perhaps form a better idea of it by being told that it was impossible to stand upright anywhere but in the very center. Now, as this room wanted the conveniency of a closet, Molly had to supply that defect, nailed up an old rug against the rafters of the house, which enclosed a little hole where her best apparel, such as the remains of that sack which we have formerly mentioned, some fine caps, and other treasures with which she had lately provided herself, were hung up and secured from the dust. This enclosed place exactly fronted the foot of the bed, to which indeed the rug hung so near that it served in a manner to supply the want of curtains. Now whether Molly, in the agonies of her rage, pushed this rug with her feet, or Jones might inadvertently touch it, or whether the pin or nail gave way of its own accord, tired of its duty, I am not certain. But as Molly pronounced those last words, which are recorded above the wicked rug, got loose from its fastening and fell away, discovering everything hid behind it, where, among other female utensils, appeared with shame, "I write it, and with sorrow will it be," read the philosopher Square, in a posture, for the place would not near admit his standing upright, as ridiculous as can possibly be conceived by the most fertile imagination. The posture, indeed, in which he stood was not greatly unlike that of a soldier who is tied neck and heels, or rather resembling the attitude in which we often see fellows in the public streets of London who are not suffering, but deserving punishment by so standing. He had a nightcap belonging to Molly, perched precariously on his head, and his two large philosophical eyes, the moment the rug fell, stared directly at Jones with an expression of pure, unadulterated astonishment, so that when the idea of lofty philosophy was added to the figure now discovered, it would have been very difficult for any spectator to have refrained from immoderate laughter. It was a tableau vivant of the absurdity of human pretension, I question not but the surprise of the reader will be here equal to that of Jones, as the suspicions which must arise from the appearance of this wise and grave man in such a place may seem so inconsistent with that character which he hath doubtless maintained hitherto in the opinion of everyone. But to confess the truth, this inconsistency is rather imaginary than real. Philosophers are composed of flesh and blood as well as other human creatures, and however sublimated and refined the theory of these may be, a little practical frailty is as incident to them as to other mortals. It is indeed in theory only, and not in practice, as we have before hinted, that consists the difference. For though such great beings think much better and more wisely, they always act exactly like other men. They know very well how to subdue all appetites and passions, and to despise both pain and pleasure. And this knowledge affords much delightful contemplation, and is easily acquired. But the practice would be vexatious and troublesome, and therefore the same wisdom which teaches them to know this, teaches them to avoid carrying it into execution. Why should they deny themselves the pleasures of the flesh when their minds have already mastered the concept? Mr. Square happened to be at church on that memorable Sunday when, as the reader may be pleased to remember, the appearance of Molly in her fine sack had caused all that disturbance. Here he first observed her, and was so quietly pleased with her buxom rural beauty that he prevailed with the young gentleman to change their intended ride that evening, that he might pass by the habitation of Molly, and by that means might obtain a second chance of seeing her. This reason, however, as he did not at that time mention to any, so neither did we think proper to communicate it then to the reader. Among other particulars which constituted the unfitness of things in Mr. Square's opinion, danger and difficulty were two. The difficulty therefore which he apprehended there might be in corrupting this young wench, and the danger which would accrue to his character on the discovery, were such strong dissuasives that it is probable he at first intended to have contented himself with the pleasing ideas which the sight of beauty furnishes us with. These, the gravest men, after a full meal of serious meditation, often allow themselves by way of dessert, for which purpose certain books and pictures find their way into the most private recesses of their study, and a certain liquorish part of natural philosophy is often the principal subject of their conversation. But when the philosopher heard a day or two afterwards that the fortress of virtue had already been subdued by another, he began to give a larger scope to his desires. His appetite was not of that squeamish kind which cannot feed on a dainty because another hath tasted it. In short, he liked the girl the better for the want of that chastity which, if she had possessed, it must have been a bar to his pleasures. He pursued and obtained her with a clear philosophical conscience. The reader will be mistaken if he thinks Molly gave Square the preference to her younger lover. On the contrary, had she been confined to the choice of one only, Tom Jones would undoubtedly have been of the two the victorious person. Nor was it solely the consideration that two are better than one, though this had its proper weight, to which Mr. Square owed his success. The absence of Jones during his confinement was an unlucky circumstance, and in that interval some well-chosen presents from the philosopher, a ribbon, a guinea, a promise of more, so softened and unguarded the girl's heart that a favorable opportunity became irresistible, and Square triumphed over the ribbon. Poor, beleaguered remains of virtue which subsisted in the bosom of Molly. It was now about a fortnight since this conquest when Jones paid the above-mentioned visit to his mistress at a time when she and Square were in bed together. This was the true reason why the mother denied her, as we have seen, for as the old woman shared in the profits arising from the iniquity of her daughter, she encouraged and protected her in it to the utmost of her power. But such was the envy and hatred which the elder sister bore towards Molly, that notwithstanding she had some part of the booty, she would willingly have parted with this to ruin her sister and spoil her trade. Hence, she had acquainted Jones with her being above stairs in bed, in hopes that he might have caught her in Square's arms. This, however, Molly found means to prevent, as the door was fastened, which gave her an opportunity of conveying her lover behind that rug or blanket where he now was so unhappily discovered. Square no sooner made his appearance than Molly flung herself back in her bed, cried out she was undone, and abandoned herself to despair. This poor girl, who was yet but a novice in her business, had not arrived to that perfection of assurance which helps off a town lady in any extremity, and either prompts her with a ready excuse, or else inspires her to brazen out the matter with her husband, who from love of quiet, or out of fear of his reputation, and sometimes, perhaps from fear of the gallant, who like Mr. Constant in the Cromstant play wears a sword, is glad to shut his eyes, and content to put his horns in his pocket. Molly, on the contrary, was silenced by this damning evidence, and very fairly gave up a cause which she had hitherto maintained with so many tears and with such solemn and vehement protestations of the purest love and constancy. As to the gentleman behind the arras, he was not in much less consternation. He stood for a while, motionless, bent like a bow, and seemed equally at a loss what to say or whither to direct his eyes. Jones, though perhaps the most astonished of the three, first found his tongue, and being immediately recovered from those uneasy sensations which Molly, by her upbraidings, had occasioned, he burst into a loud, uncontrollable laughter, and then saluting Mr. Square with a mock bow, advanced to take him by the hand and to relieve him from his place of undignified confinement. Square, being now arrived in the middle of the room, in which part only he could stand upright, looked at Jones with a very grave countenance and said to him, "Well, sir, I see you enjoy this mighty discovery, and I dare swear take great delight in the thoughts of exposing me. But if you will consider the matter fairly, you will find you are yourself only to blame. I am not guilty of corrupting innocence. I have done nothing for which that part of the world which judges of matters by the rule of right will condemn me. Fitness is governed by the nature of things, and not by customs, forms, or municipal laws. Nothing is indeed unfit, which is not unnatural." "Well reasoned, old boy," answered Jones, his laughter subsiding into a wry smile. "But why dost thou think that I should desire to expose thee? I promise thee I was never better pleased with thee in my life, and unless thou hast a mind to discover it thyself, this affair may remain a profound secret for me." "Nay, Mr. Jones," replied Square, drawing himself up to his full cramped height, "I would not be thought to undervalue reputation. Good fame is a species of the kalon, and it is by no means fitting to neglect it. Besides, to murder one's own reputation is a kind of suicide, a detestable and odious vice. If you think proper, therefore, to conceal any infirmity of mine, for such I may have, since no man is perfectly perfect, I promise you I will not betray myself. Things may be fitting to be done, which are not fitting to be boasted of, for by the perverse judgment of the world, that often becomes the subject of censure, which is in truth not only innocent, but laudable. Right, cries Jones. What can be more innocent than the indulgence of a natural appetite? Or what more laudable than the propagation of our species? To be serious with you, answered Square, finding a firmer footing in philosophy than in his physical situation, I profess, they always appeared so to me. And yet, said Jones with a piercing look, you was of a different opinion when my affair with this girl was first discovered. Why, I must confess, says Square, slightly flustered as the matter was misrepresented to me by that Parson Thwackum, I might condemn the corruption of innocence. It was that, sir, it was that, and that, for you must know, Mr. Jones, in consideration of fitness, very minute circumstances, sir, very minute circumstances cause great alteration. Well, cries Jones, cutting short the sophistry, be that as it will, it shall be your own fault, as I have promised you, if you ever hear any more of this adventure. Behave kindly to the girl, and I will never open my lips concerning the matter to anyone. And Molly, do you be faithful to your friend, and I will not only forgive your infidelity to me, but will do you all the service I can. So saying, he took a hasty leave, and slipping down the ladder with the agility of a man released from a great burden, retired with much expedition. Square was rejoiced to find this awkward adventure was likely to have no worse conclusion, and as for Molly, being recovered from her confusion, she began at first to upbraid Square with having been the occasion of her loss of Jones, but that gentleman soon found the means of mitigating her anger, partly by caresses and partly by a small nostrum from his purse of wonderful and approved efficacy in purging off the ill humours of the mind and in restoring it to a good temper. She then poured forth a vast profusion of tenderness towards her new lover, turned all she had said to Jones and Jones himself into ridicule, and vowed, though he once had the possession of her person, that none but Square had ever been master of her heart. The discovery of Molly's infidelity, so blatantly revealed by the unfortunate descent of a rug, would have vindicated a much greater degree of resentment than the relatively mild reaction Jones expressed on the occasion. Indeed, if he had abandoned her directly from that moment, and severing all ties with a cold and final word, very few, I believe, would have blamed him for such a justified retreat. Certain, however, it is that he saw her not through the lens of betrayal, but in the soft, forgiving light of compassion, and though his love for her had never been of that profound, soul-consuming kind which could give him any great and lasting uneasiness at her inconstancy, yet was he not a little shocked on reflecting that he had himself originally corrupted her innocence, for to this initial corruption he imputed all the subsequent vice into which she appeared now so likely to plunge herself with a philosopher in one attic and a country gallant in the shadows. The weight of this responsibility sat heavily upon his noble spirit. This consideration gave him no little uneasiness, a lingering sense of guilt that clung to him like a morning fog, until Betty, the elder sister, a creature made of equal parts envy and opportunism, was so kind some time afterwards to cure him by a carefully dropped hint. She revealed that one Will Barnes, and not himself, had been the first seducer of Molly, and that the little child which he had hitherto so certainly concluded to be his own might very probably have an equal title, at least to claim the notorious Barnes for its father. It was a revelation that severed the last chain of obligation binding him to that chapter of his life. Jones, with the focused intensity of a man whose honor is suddenly unshackled, eagerly pursued this scent when he had first received it, and in a very short time was sufficiently assured that the girl had told him truth, not only by the brazen confession of the fellow himself who boasted of it, but at last by the reluctant, tear-streaked admission of Molly herself. This Will Barnes was a professional country gallant, a man who had acquired as many trophies of this kind as any ensign in the army or attorney's clerk in the kingdom. He had indeed reduced several women to a state of utter profligacy, had coldly broke the hearts of some, and carried the dark honor of occasioning the violent death of one poor girl who had either drowned herself in a fit of despair, or what was rather more probable, had been drowned by him in a moment of brutal negligence. Among other of his sordid conquests, this fellow had once triumphed over the vulnerable heart of Betty Seagrim. He had made love to her long before Molly was grown to be a fit object of that pastime, but had afterwards deserted her without a second thought, and applied to her younger, prettier sister, with whom he had almost immediate success. Now Will had in reality held the sole possession of Molly's fickle affection all along, while Jones and Square were almost equally sacrifices not to her heart, but to her calculated interest and her voracious pride. Hence had grown that implacable, venomous hatred which we have before seen raging in the narrow mind of Betty, though we did not think it necessary to assign this deeper cause sooner, as envy itself alone was a motive entirely adequate to all the malicious effects we have previously mentioned. Jones was become perfectly easy by possession of this secret with regard to Molly. A great burden of misplaced responsibility had been lifted from his shoulders, but as to Sophia, he was far from being in a state of tranquility. Nay, indeed, he was under the most violent and constant perturbation. His heart was now, if I may use the metaphor, entirely evacuated of its former tenant, and Sophia took absolute, undisputed possession of it. He loved her with an unbounded, consuming passion, and yet plainly saw the tender, trembling sentiments she had for him. Yet could not this sweet assurance lessen his despair of obtaining the consent of her father, nor quiet the horrors which attended the very thought of pursuing her by any base or treacherous method. The injury which he must thus do to the boisterous but fundamentally generous Mr. Weston, and the profound concern which would accrue to the venerable Mr. Allworthy, were circumstances that tormented him all day and haunted his pillow in the sleepless watches of the night. His life became a constant, exhausting struggle between honor and inclination, which alternately triumphed over each other in his mind like two great armies locked in a bloody, indecisive battle. He often resolved, in the absence of Sophia, to leave her father's house to flee from temptation, and to see her no more. And as often the moment she entered the room, her very presence would dissolve all those noble resolutions, and he would determine to pursue her at the hazard of his life and at the forfeiture of what was much dearer to him, the esteem, those he loved as fathers. This internal conflict began soon to produce very strong and visible effects upon his person and spirit, for he lost all his usual sprightliness and gaiety of temper, that infectious joy that had once defined him, and became not only melancholy when alone, but dejected and absent in company. His laughter, when it came, was a hollow echo of its former self. Nay, if ever he put on a forced mirth to comply with Mr. Weston's rustic humour, the constraint appeared so plain, the strain so evident, that he seemed to have been giving the strongest evidence of the very sorrow he endeavoured to conceal by such ostentatious display. It may perhaps be a question for the philosophers whether the art which he used to conceal his passion, or the means which honest, unruly nature employed to reveal it, betrayed him most completely. For while art made him more than ever reserved to Sophia, and forbade him to address any of his discourse to her, nay, to avoid meeting her eyes with the utmost caution, as if her gaze were the sun he dared not look upon, nature was no less busy in counterplotting him. Hence, at the approach of the young lady he grew pale, and if this was sudden, he started as if from a gunshot. If his eyes accidentally met hers, the blood rushed into his cheeks with the force of a sudden tide, and his countenance became all over scarlet. If common civility ever obliged him to speak to her as to drink her health at table, his tongue was sure to falter, tripping over the simplest words. If he touched her his hand, nay, his whole frame trembled so violently he feared he might collapse. And if any discourse tended, however, remotely to raise the idea of love, an involuntary sigh, heavy with the weight of his impossible affection, seldom failed to steal from his bosom, most of which accidents nature was wonderfully industrious to throw daily in his way, as if determined to expose the very heart he was so desperate to hide. All these symptoms, so glaring to anyone acquainted with the language of love, escaped the notice of the squire, whose perceptions were tuned only to the cries of hounds and the ring of a gallop, but not so of Sophia. She soon perceived these subtle agitations of mind in Jones, and was at no loss to discover the cause, for indeed she recognized the very same tempest in her own breast. And this recognition is, I suppose, that secret sympathy which hath been so often noted in lovers, a silent telegraph of the heart, and which will sufficiently account for her being so much quicker sighted than her father. But to say the truth, there is a more simple and plain method of accounting for that prodigious superiority of penetration which we must observe in some men over the rest of the human species, and one which will serve not only in the case of lovers, but of all others. From whence is it that the knave is generally so quick-sighted to those symptoms and operations of knavery which often dupe an honest man of a much better understanding? There surely is no general sympathy among knaves, nor have they, like Freemasons, any common sign of communication. In reality, it is only because they have the same thing in their heads, and their thoughts are turned the same way. Thus that Sophia saw and that Western did not see the plain symptoms of love in Jones can be no wonder when we consider that the idea of love never entered into the head of the father, whereas the daughter, at present, thought of nothing else, her every waking moment colored by its light and shadow. When Sophia was well satisfied of the violent passion which tormented poor Jones, and no less certain that she herself was its sole object, she had not the least difficulty in discovering the true cause of his present behavior, his avoidance, his silence, his tortured looks. This highly endeared him to her, and raised in her mind two of the best affections which any lover can wish to raise in a mistress. These were esteem and pity. For sure, the most outrageously rigid among her sex will excuse her pitying a man whom she saw miserable on her own account, nor can they blame her for esteeming one who visibly, from the most honourable motives, endeavoured to smother a flame in his own bosom, which, like the famous Spartan theft of the fox, was preying upon and consuming his very vitals. Thus his backwardness, his shunning her, his coldness, and his silence became the forwardest, the most diligent, the warmest, and most eloquent advocates, and wrought so violently on her sensible and tender heart that she soon felt for him all those gentle sensations which are consistent with a virtuous and elevated female mind. In short, all which esteem, gratitude, and pity can inspire in such a soul towards an agreeable man, indeed all which the nicest delicacy can allow. In a word, she was in love with him, to distraction, a sweet and terrifying reality that now governed her every thought. One day, this young couple accidentally met in the garden at the end of the two walks which were both bounded by that same canal in which Jones had formerly risked drowning to retrieve the little bird that Sophia had there lost. The place was heavy with the memory of that first unspoken connection. This place had been of late much frequented by Sophia. Here she used to ruminate with a mixture of pain and exquisite pleasure on an incident which, however trifling in itself, had possibly sown the first seeds of that affection which was now arrived to such a mighty and overwhelming maturity in her heart. Here, then, as if drawn by the same invisible thread of fate, this young couple met. They were almost close enough to feel the other's breath before either of them knew anything of the other's approach. A bystander would have discovered sufficient marks of confusion in the countenance of each, the quickened breath, the downcast eyes, the flush of crimson, but they felt too much themselves, were too lost in their own turbulent emotions to make any calm observation of the other. As soon as Jones had a little recovered his first surprise, he accosted the young lady with some of the ordinary strained forms of salutation, which she, in the same manner, returned her voice, barely a whisper, and their conversation began as usual on the safe, delicious beauty of the morning. Hence they passed to the beauty of the place itself, on which Jones launched forth, very high encomiums his words, flowing to hide the panic in his heart. When they came to the very tree whence he had formerly tumbled into the canal, Sophia could not help reminding him of that accident, and said with a faint, nostalgic smile, "I fancy, Mr. Jones, you have some little shuddering when you see that water." "I assure you, madam," answered Jones, his eyes, locking with hers for a dangerous moment. The concern you felt at the loss of your little bird will always appear to me the highest circumstance in that adventure. Poor little Tommy, there is the branch he stood upon. How could the little wretch have the folly to fly away from that state of happiness in which I had the honor to place him? His fate was a just punishment for his ingratitude. Upon my word, Mr. Jones, said she, your gallantry very narrowly escaped as severe a fate. Sure the remembrance must affect you. Indeed, madam, answered he, the mask of light conversation slipping, if I have any reason to reflect with sorrow on it. It is perhaps that the water had not been a little deeper, by which I might have escaped many bitter heartaches that fortune seems to have in store for me. Fie, Mr. Jones, replied Sophia, a gentle reproof in her tone. I am sure you cannot be in earnest now. This affected contempt of life is only an excess of your complacence to me. You would endeavor to lessen the obligation of having twice ventured it for my sake. Beware the third time. She spoke these last words with a smile and a softness inexpressible, a tenderness that threatened to undo him completely. Jones answered with a sigh torn from the depths of his soul. He feared it was already too late for caution, and then looking tenderly and steadfastly on her, he cried, "Oh, Miss Western, can you desire me to live? Can you wish me so ill?" Sophia, looking down on the ground, her composure crumbling, answered with some hesitation, "Indeed, Mr. Jones, I do not wish you ill. Oh, I know too well that heavenly temper," cries Jones, "that divine goodness which is beyond every other charm." "Nay," now answered she, flustered and retreating, "I understand you not. I can stay no longer. I would not be understood," cries he, desperate and incoherent. "Nay, I can't be understood. I know not what I say. Meeting you here so unexpectedly, I have been unguarded for. Heaven's sake, pardon me if I have said anything to offend you. I did not mean it. Indeed, I would rather have died. Nay, the very thought would kill me." "You surprise me," answered she, her own heart beating a wild rhythm. "How can you possibly think you have offended me? Fear, madam, says he easily runs into madness, and there is no degree of fear like that which I feel of offending you. How can I speak then? Nay, don't look angrily at me. One frown will destroy me. I mean nothing. Blame my eyes, or blame those beauties. What am I saying? Pardon me if I have said too much. My heart overflowed. I have struggled with my love to the utmost, and have endeavored to conceal a fever which preys on my vitals, and will, I hope, soon make it impossible for me ever to offend you more." Mr. Jones now fell a trembling, as if he had been shaken with the fit of an ague, his whole body betraying the storm within. Sophia, who was in a situation not very different from his, her own knees, feeling perilously weak, answered in these words, "Mr. Jones, I will not affect to misunderstand you. Indeed, I understand you too well, but, for heaven's sake, if you have any affection for me, let me make the best of my way into the house. I wish I may be able to support myself thither." Jones, who was hardly able to support himself, his world having narrowed to this single trembling point, offered her his arm, which she condescended to accept, but begged he would not mention a word more to her of this nature at present. He promised he would not, insisting only on her forgiveness of what love, without the leave of his will, had forced from him this. She told him he knew how to obtain by his future behavior, and thus this young pair tottered and trembled along the garden path, a picture of exquisite agony and bliss. The lover, not once daring to squeeze the hand of his mistress, though it was locked in his, a silent, burning testament to the understanding that now existed between them. Sophia immediately retired to her chamber, where Mrs. Honor and the hartshorn were summoned to her assistance to calm her fluttering spirits. As to poor Jones, the only relief to his distempered mind was an unwelcome piece of news, which, as it opens a scene of different nature from those in which the reader hath lately been conversant, will be communicated to him in the next chapter. A curious change had come over the dynamics of Squire Western's household. The burly squire had become so fond of Jones, so delighted by his robust constitution and agreeable company in the field, that he was deeply unwilling to part with him, though the young man's arm had been long since cured and restored to its former strength. And Jones, whether from a genuine love of sport, a reluctance to return to the more solemn atmosphere of Allworthy's estate, or from some other more compelling reason that bloomed in the form of Sophia Western, was easily persuaded to continue his residence at the squire's house. He did so sometimes for a fortnight together, without paying a single visit to Mr. Allworthy's, nay, without ever receiving or sending a message. Thence, so absorbed was he in the new life that unfolded daily before him. Meanwhile, at his own estate, Mr. Allworthy had been for some days indisposed, with a cold which had been attended with a little fever. This he had, however, neglected, as it was usual with him to do all manner of disorders which did not confine him to his bed, or prevent his several faculties from performing their ordinary functions. It was a stoic conduct, which we would by no means be thought to approve or recommend to the imitation of our readers, for surely the gentlemen of the Aesculapian art are in the right in advising that the moment the disease has entered at one door, the physician should be introduced at the other. What else is meant by that old adage, venienti occurrite morbo, oppose a distemper at its first approach? Thus the doctor and the disease meet in fair and equal conflict on the open field of the patient's body, whereas, by giving time to the latter, we often suffer him to fortify and entrench himself like a French army behind its earthworks, so that the learned gentleman finds it very difficult and sometimes impossible to come at the enemy. Nay, sometimes by gaining time the disease applies to the French military politics and corrupts nature over to his side, and then all the powers of physic must arrive too late, mere spectators to a surrender. Agreeable to these observations was, I remember, the complaint of the great Dr. Misorban, who used very pathetically to lament the late applications which were made to his skill, saying, "Byga, me believe my patient take me for de undertaker, for they never send for me till the physician have killed them." Mr. Allworthy's distemper, by means of this noble neglect, gained such ground that when the increase of his fever obliged him at last to send for assistance, the doctor at his first arrival shook his head with a grave and professional solemnity, wished he had been sent for sooner, and intimated that he thought him in very imminent danger. Mr. Allworthy, however, who had settled all his affairs in this world, and was as well prepared as it is possible for human nature to be for the other, received this dire information with the utmost calmness and unconcern. He could indeed, whenever he laid himself down to rest, say with Cato in the tragical poem, "Let guilt or fear disturb man's rest." Cato knows neither of them, indifferent in his choice to sleep or die. In reality, he could say this with 10 times more reason and confidence than Cato or any other proud fellow among the ancient or modern heroes, for he was not only devoid of fear, but might be considered as a faithful laborer who at the end of a long and honest harvest is summoned to receive his reward at the hands of a bountiful and loving master. The good man, sensing the finality of the hour, gave immediate orders for all his family to be summoned round him. None of these were then abroad, but Mrs. Blifil, who had been some time in London, and Mr. Jones, whom the reader hath just parted from at Mr. Syme Western's, and who received this summons just as Sophia had left him in a state of the most exquisite emotional turmoil. The news of Mr. Allworthy's danger for the servant in his haste and simplicity told him he was dying, acted as a sudden chilling douche on the fever of his passion. It drove all thoughts of love, all visions of Sophia out of his head instantly. He hurried into the chariot which was sent for him, and ordered the coachman to drive with all imaginable haste, nor did the idea of Sophia, I believe, once occur to him. On the way, so completely was his soul absorbed in dread and grief for his benefactor. In moments of crisis, true character is revealed. What do you think will become of Jones now? Share your predictions in the comments below. And now the whole family, namely Mr. Blifil, Mr. Jones, Mr. Thwackum, Mr. Square, and some of the principal servants, for such were Mr. Allworthy's orders, being all assembled round his bed. The good man sat up in it, propped by pillows, his face pale but serene. He was beginning to speak when Blifil fell to blubbering most ostentatiously and began to express very loud and bitter lamentations. Upon this, Mr. Allworthy shook him by the hand, a gesture of gentle reproof, and said, "Do not sorrow thus, my dear nephew, at the most ordinary of all human occurrences. When misfortunes befall our friends, we are justly grieved, for those are accidents which might often have been avoided, and which may seem to render the lot of one man more peculiarly unhappy than that of others. But death is certainly unavoidable, and is that common lot in which alone the fortunes of all men agree, nor is the time when this happens to us very material. If the wisest of men hath compared life to a span, surely we may be allowed to consider it as a single day. It is my fate to leave it in the evening, but those who are taken away earlier have only lost a few hours, at the best little worth lamenting, and much oftener hours of labor and fatigue, of pain and sorrow. One of the Roman poets, I remember, likens our leaving life to our departure from a feast, a thought which hath often occurred to me when I have seen men struggling to protract an entertainment and to enjoy the company of their friends a few moments longer. Alas, how short is the most protracted of such enjoyments, how immaterial the difference between him who retires the soonest and him who stays the latest. This is seeing life in the best view, and this unwillingness to quit our friends is the most amiable motive from which we can derive the fear of death, and yet the longest enjoyment which we can hope for of this kind is of so trivial a duration that it is to a wise man truly contemptible. Few men, I own, think in this manner, for indeed few men think of death till they are in its jaws. However gigantic and terrible an object this may appear when it approaches them, they are nevertheless incapable of seeing it at any distance. Nay, though they have been ever so much alarmed and frightened, when they have apprehended themselves in danger of dying, they are no sooner cleared from this apprehension than even the fears of it are erased from their minds. But alas, he who escapes from death is not pardoned. He is only reprieved, and reprieved to a short day. Grieve therefore no more, my dear child. On this occasion, an event which may happen every hour, which every element, nay, almost every particle of matter that surrounds us is capable of producing, and which must and will most unavoidably reach us all at last, ought neither to occasion our surprise nor our lamentation. My physician, having acquainted me, which I take very kindly of him, that I am in danger of leaving you all very shortly, I have determined to say a few words to you at this our parting, before my distemper, which I find grows very fast upon me, puts it out of my power, but I shall waste my strength too much. I intended to speak concerning my will, which, though I have settled long ago, I think proper to mention such heads of it as concern any of you, that I may have the comfort of perceiving you are all satisfied with the provision I have there made for you. Nephew Blifil, I leave you the heir to my whole estate, except only £500 a year, which is to revert to you after the death of your mother, and except one other estate of £500 a year, and the sum of £6,000, which I have bestowed in the following manner: the estate of £500 a year I have given to you, Mr. Jones, and as I know the inconvenience which attends the want of ready money, I have added £1,000 in specie. In this I know not whether I have exceeded or fallen short of your expectation. Perhaps you will think I have given you too little, and the world will be as ready to condemn me for giving you too much. But the latter censure I despise, and as to the former, unless you should entertain that common error which I have often heard in my life pleaded as an excuse for a total want of charity, namely, that instead of raising gratitude by voluntary acts of bounty, we are apt to raise demands which of all others are the most boundless and most difficult to satisfy. Pardon me the bare mention of this. I will not suspect any such thing. Jones, upon hearing this, was overcome by a wave of emotion so powerful it robbed him of all speech. He flung himself at his benefactor's feet, and taking eagerly hold of his hand, assured him his goodness to him, both now and all other times, had so infinitely exceeded not only his merit, but his wildest hopes, that no words could express his sense of it. And I assure you, sir, said he, his voice thick with unshed tears, your present generosity hath left me no other concern than for the present melancholy occasion. O my friend, my father, here His words choked him, and he turned away to hide a tear which was starting from his eyes, a tear of pure, unadulterated grief and love. Allworthy then gently squeezed his hand, a silent communication of deep affection, and proceeded. Thus, I am convinced, my child, that you have much goodness, generosity, and honor in your temper. If you will add prudence and religion to these, you must be happy. For the three former qualities, I admit, make you worthy of happiness, but they are the latter only which will put you in possession of it. £1,000 I have given to you, Mr. Thwackum, a sum, I am convinced, which greatly exceeds your desires as well as your wants. However, you will receive it as a memorial of my friendship, and whatever superfluities may redound to you, that piety which you so rigidly maintain will instruct you how to dispose of them. A like sum, Mr. Square, I have bequeathed to you. This, I hope, will enable you to pursue your profession with better success than hitherto. I have often observed with concern that distress is more apt to excite contempt than commiseration, especially among men of business with whom poverty is understood to indicate want of ability. But the little I have been able to leave you will extricate you from those difficulties with which you have formerly struggled, and then I doubt not but you will meet with sufficient prosperity to supply what a man of your philosophical temper will require. I find myself growing faint, so I shall refer you to my will for my disposition of the residue. My servants will there find some tokens to remember me by, and there are a few charities which I trust my executors will see faithfully performed. Bless you all. I am setting out a little before you. The weight of inheritance and the burden of legacy, a turning point for every character. If you're invested in their fates, please subscribe to follow this dramatic journey. Here, a footman came hastily into the room, his face a mask of urgency, and said there was an attorney from Salisbury who had a particular message which he said he must communicate to Mr. Allworthy himself, that he seemed in a violent hurry and protested, and he had so much business to do that if he could cut himself into 4 quarters, all would not be sufficient. Go, child, said Allworthy, to Bliffle, his voice now weak whisper. See what the gentleman wants. I am not able to do any business now, nor can he have any with me, in which you are not at present more concerned than myself. Besides, I really am. I am incapable of seeing anyone at present, or of any longer attention. He then saluted them all with a slow, weary gaze, saying, perhaps he should be able to see them again, but he should be now glad to compose himself a little, finding that he had too much exhausted his spirits in the noble effort of his final discourse. Some of the company shed tears at their parting, and even the philosopher Square wiped his eyes, albeit unused to the melting mood. As to Mrs. Wilkins, she dropped her pearls as fast as the Arabian trees their medicinal gums, for this was a ceremonial which that gentlewoman never omitted, on a proper occasion, finding in it a sublime satisfaction that was almost professional. After this, Mr. Allworthy again laid himself down on his pillow and endeavored to compose himself to rest, while the outside world, with all its pressing business and hidden truths, waited impatiently at the door. Beyond the genuine, albeit performative, grief for her master, there was another more potent source for that briny stream, which so plentifully rose above the 2 mountainous cheekbones of the housekeeper, Mrs. Wilkins. She was no sooner retired from the solemn deathbed scene than she began to mutter to herself in the following pleasant strain, her voice a low venomous hiss in the deserted corridor. Sure, master might have made some difference, methinks, between me and the other common servants. I suppose he hath left me mourning, but I fackins, if that be all the devil shall wear it for him for me, I'd have his worship know I am no beggar. I have saved £500 in his service, and after all to be used in this manner, it is a fine encouragement to servants to be honest. And to be sure, if I have taken a little something now and then, others have taken 10 times as much, and now we are all put in a lump together. If so be that it be so, the legacy may go to the devil with him that gave it. No, I won't give it up neither, because that will please some folks. No, I'll buy the gayest gown I can get and dance over the old curmudgeon's grave in it. This is my reward for taking his part so often when all the country have cried shame of him for breeding up his bastard in that manner. But he is going now where he must pay for all. It would have become him better to have repented of his sins on his deathbed than to glory in them and give away his estate out of his own family to a misbegotten child. Found in his bed, forsooth, a pretty story. One would have thought he might have mentioned my name as well as that of Square, but he is a gentleman forsooth, though he had not cloths on his back when he came hither first. Marry, come up with such gentlemen, though he hath lived here this many years, I don't believe there is arrow, a servant in the house, ever saw the colour of his money. The devil shall wait upon such a gentleman for me. Much more of the like kind, she muttered to herself, a torrent of ingratitude and spite. But this taste shall suffice to the reader. Neither Thwackum nor Square were much better satisfied with their legacies, though their disappointment was cloaked in a more refined hypocrisy. Though they breathed not their resentment so loud, yet from the dark discontent which appeared in their countenances, as well as from the following dialogue we collect, that no great pleasure reigned in their minds. About an hour after they had left the sick room, Square met Thwackum in the hall and accosted him thus, his voice laced with a sarcastic cordiality. "Well, sir, have you heard any news of your friend since we parted from him? If you mean Mr. Allworthy," answered Thwackum, his jaw tight, "I think you might rather give him the appellation of your friend, for he seems to me to have deserved that title by his recent generosity." "The title is as good on your side," replied Square, with a cold smile for his bounty. "Such as it is hath been equal to both. £1,000 apiece is a notable leveller of distinctions. I should not have mentioned it first," cries Thwackum, his temper fraying. "But since you begin, I must inform you I am of a different opinion. There is a wide distinction between voluntary favours and just rewards. The duty I have done in his family and the care I have taken in the education of his 2 boys are services for which some men might have expected a greater return. I would not have you imagine I am therefore dissatisfied, for St. Paul hath taught me to be content with the little I have. Had the modicum been less, I should have known my duty. But though the Scriptures oblige me to remain contented, it doth not enjoin me to shut my eyes to my own merit, nor restrain me from seeing when I am injured by an unjust comparison." "Since you provoke me," returned Square, his philosophical composure cracking that injury is done to me, "nor did I ever imagine Mr. Allworthy had held my friendship so light as to put me in balance with one who received his wages. I know to what it is owing. It proceeds from those narrow principles which you have been so long endeavoring to infuse into him in contempt of everything which is great and noble. The beauty and loveliness of friendship is too strong for dim eyes, nor can it be perceived by any other medium than that unerring rule of right which you have so often endeavored to ridicule, that you have perverted your friends. Understanding, I wish, cries Thwackum in a mounting rage. I wish, for the sake of his soul, your damnable doctrines have not perverted his faith. It is to this I impute his present behavior, so unbecoming a Christian, who, but an atheist, could think of leaving the world without having first made up his account, without confessing his sins, and receiving that absolution which he knew he had one in the house duly authorized to give him. He will feel the want of these necessaries when it is too late, when he is arrived at that place where there is wailing and gnashing of teeth. It is then he will find in what mighty stead that heathen goddess, that virtue which you and all other deists of the age adore, will stand him. He will then summon his priest when there is none to be found, and will lament the want of that absolution without which no sinner can be safe. If it be so material, says Square with a disdainful curl of his lip, why don't you present it him of your own accord? It hath no virtue, cries Thwackum, but to those who have sufficient grace to require it. But why do I talk thus to a heathen and an unbeliever? It is you that taught him this lesson, for which you have been well rewarded in this world, as I doubt not your disciple will soon be in the other. I know not what you mean by reward, said Square, drawing himself up. But if you hint at that pitiful memorial of our friendship which he hath thought fit to bequeath me, I despise it, and nothing but the unfortunate situation of my circumstances should prevail on me to accept it. The hypocrisy of these learned men is staggering. Who do you think is more in the wrong, Thwackum or Square? Debate it in the comments. The physician now arrived, breaking into their heated dispute, and began to inquire of the two red-faced disputants, "How does your patient above stairs?" "In a miserable way," answered Thwackum, still seething. "It is no more than I expected," cries the doctor, shaking his head with professional gravity. "But pray, what symptoms have appeared since I left you?" "No good ones, I am afraid," replied Thwackum, misunderstanding the query entirely after what passed at our departure. "I think there were little hopes. The bodily physician, perhaps, misunderstood the curer of souls, and before they came to a proper explanation, Mr. Blifil came to them with a countenance artfully composed into the most melancholy cast, and acquainted them that he brought sad news that his mother was dead at Salisbury, that she had been seized on the road home with a most violent fit of the gout in her head and stomach, which had carried her off in a few hours. "Good lack a day," says the doctor, "one cannot answer for events, but I wish I had been at hand to have been called in. The gout is a distemper which it is difficult to treat, yet I have been remarkably successful in it." Thwackum and Square both condoled with Mr. Blifil for the loss of his mother, which the one advised him to bear like a man, and the other like a Christian. The young gentleman said he knew very well we were all mortal, and he would endeavour to submit to his loss as well as he could. That he could not, however, help complaining a little against the peculiar severity of his fate, which brought the news of so great a calamity to him, by surprise, and that at a time when he hourly expected the severest blow he was capable of feeling from the malice of fortune. He said the present occasion would put to the test those excellent rudiments which he had learnt from Mr. Thwackum and Mr. Square, and it would be entirely owing to them if he was enabled to survive such manifold misfortunes. It was now debated whether Mr. Allworthy should be informed of the death of his sister. This the doctor violently opposed, in which I believe the whole College of Physicians would agree with him, for why disturb a patient with grievous news? But Mr. Blifil said he had received such positive and repeated orders from his uncle never to keep any secret from him for fear of the disquietude which concealment might give him, that he durst not think of disobedience, whatever might be the consequence. He said for his part, considering the religious and philosophic temper of his uncle, he could not agree with the doctor in his apprehensions. He was therefore resolved to communicate it to him, for if his uncle recovered, as he heartily prayed he might, he knew he would never forgive an endeavour to keep a secret of this kind from him. The physician was forced to submit to these resolutions, which the two other learned gentlemen very highly commended, seeing in it an opportunity to demonstrate their own influence. So together moved Mr. Blifil and the doctor toward the sick room, where the physician first entered and approached the bed with solemn steps in order to feel his patient's pulse, which he had no sooner done than he declared he was much improved, that the last application had succeeded to a miracle, and had brought the fever to intermit, so that he said there appeared now to be as little danger as he had before apprehended. There were hopes. It is the way of his profession to navigate between the extremes of despair and optimism. To say the truth, Mr. Allworthy's situation had never been so bad as the great caution of the doctor had represented it. But as a wise general never despises his enemy, however inferior that enemy's force may be, so neither doth a wise physician ever despise a distemper, however inconsiderably, as the former preserves the same strict discipline, places the same guards, and employs the same scouts, though the enemy be never so weak, so the latter maintains the same gravity of countenance, and shakes his head with the same significant air, let the distemper be never so trifling, and both, among many other good ones, may assign this solid reason for their conduct, that by these means the greater glory redounds to them if they gain the victory, and the less disgrace if by any unlucky accident they should happen to be conquered. The twists of fate in this tale are relentless. To never miss a chapter, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Mr. Allworthy had no sooner lifted up his eyes and thanked heaven for these sudden hopes of his recovery than Mr. Blifil drew near with a very dejected aspect, and having applied his handkerchief to his eye, either to wipe away his tears or to do as Ovid somewhere expresses himself on another occasion, si nullus erit tamen, excut nullum, if there be none, then wipe away that none he communicated to his uncle, what the reader hath been just before acquainted with. Allworthy received the news with profound concern, with Christian patience, and with ultimate resignation. He dropped a tender tear for a sister, then composed his countenance, and at last cried, "The Lord's will be done in everything." There was no rebellion in his heart, only a quiet acceptance of divine decree. He now inquired for the messenger, But Blifil told him it had been impossible to detain him a moment, for he appeared by the great hurry he was in to have some business of importance on his hands, that he complained of being hurried and driven and torn out of his life, and repeated many times that if he could divide himself into 4 quarters, he knew how to dispose of everyone. It was a curious haste which would later reveal its significance. Allworthy then desired Blifil to take care of the funeral. He said he would have his sister deposited in his own chapel, and as to the particulars, he left them to his own discretion, only mentioning the person whom he would have employed on this occasion, thus placing a heavy and mournful responsibility upon the shoulders of his nephew. The attentive reader may perhaps wonder at hearing nothing of Mr. Jones in the immediate proceedings of the last chapter. In fact, his behavior and the sentiments that fueled it were so radically different from that of the persons. There mentioned the avaricious, the hypocritical, the scheming, that we chose not to confound his honest, passionate name with theirs. He operated in a separate sphere of feeling altogether. When the good man had ended his speech, Jones was the last who deserted the room, held there by a bond of love and grief that the others could not fathom. Thence he retired to his own apartment to give vent to the full force of his concern, a tempest of sorrow and fear, but the restlessness of his mind, a fierce anxiety for the man who had been a father to him, would not suffer him to remain long there, a prisoner to his own dread. He slipped softly therefore to Allworthy's chamber door, where he listened with held breath for a considerable time without hearing any kind of motion within, until his straining ears detected a violent snoring from the nurse. At last his fears that cruel artist misrepresented these rustic sounds as the agonized groans of his benefactor. This so alarmed him that he could not forbear entering the room, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, where he found the good man in the bed in a sweet and composed sleep, and his nurse snoring in the above-mentioned hearty manner, a veritable foghorn of slumber at the bed's feet. He immediately took the only method of silencing this thorough bass, whose music he feared might disturb Mr. Allworthy's precious rest, and then sitting down by the nurse, he remained motionless as a statue, a silent guardian, until Blifil and the doctor came in together and waked the sick man. They did so in order that the doctor might feel his pulse, and that the other might communicate to him that piece of news which, had Jones been apprised of its content, would have had great difficulty finding its way to Mr. Allworthy's ear at such a critical season. When he first heard Blifil tell his uncle this story of Mrs. Bridget's death, Jones could hardly contain the white, hot wrath which instantly kindled in him at the other's profound indiscretion, especially as the doctor shook his head and had already declared his unwillingness to have the matter mentioned to his patient. But as his passion did not so far deprive him of all use of his understanding as to hide from him the potentially fatal consequences which any violent expression towards Blifil might have on the fragile sick man, this sobering apprehension stilled his rage for the present, and he grew afterwards so satisfied and relieved to find that this news had in fact produced no visible mischief, that he suffered his anger to die a slow smoulder in his own bosom without ever mentioning it to Blifil. The physician dined that day at Mr. Allworthy's, and having after dinner visited his patient, he returned to the company with a new air of triumph, and told them that he had now the satisfaction to say with absolute assurance that his patient was out of all danger, that he had brought his fever to a perfect intermission, and doubted not by throwing in the bark to prevent its return. He spoke as a general who had just won a decisive battle. This account so pleased Jones, so utterly liberated him from the weight of despair, that it threw him into such an immoderate and pure excess of rapture that he might be truly said to be drunk with joy, an emotional intoxication which greatly forwards the effects of the actual wine that soon followed. And as he was very free too with the bottle on this occasion, for he drank many bumpers to the doctor's health as well as to other toasts, each one a liquid celebration of life itself, he became very soon, literally, and not just metaphorically drunk. His joy was a flood that could not be contained. Jones had naturally violent animal spirits, a fiery and exuberant life force, these being set on float and wildly augmented by the spirit of wine, now produced the most extravagant and uninhibited effects. He kissed the flustered doctor and embraced him with the most passionate endearments, swearing that next to Mr. Allworthy himself, he loved him of all men living. Doctor, added he, his voice thick with emotion and alcohol, you deserve a statue to be erected to you at the public expense for having preserved a man who is not only the darling of all good men who know him, but a blessing to society, the glory of his country, and an honor to human nature. D.N. me if I don't love him better than my own soul. It was the unvarnished, hyperbolic truth of a heart too full to be prudent. More shame for you, cries Thwackum, his face pinched with disapproval, though I think you have reason to love him, for he hath provided very well for you, and perhaps it might have been better for some folks that he had not lived to see just reason of revoking his gift. It was a venomous dart, carefully aimed. Jones now looked on Thwackum with an inconceivable disdain, a look that stripped the parson of his sanctimony and saw only the pettiness beneath. He answered, "And doth thy mean soul imagine that any such considerations could weigh with me? No, let the earth open and swallow her own dirt. If I had millions of acres, I would say it rather than swallow up my dear, glorious." His sentiment echoed the poet's cry, "Quis desiderio sit pudor aut modus tam chari capitis." What modesty or measure can set bounds to our desire of so dear a friend? The word desiderium here cannot be easily translated. It includes our desperate desire of enjoying our friend again, and the profound grief which attends that very desire. The doctor now interposed and prevented the effects of a wrath which was rapidly kindling between Jones and Thwackum, after which the former, his combative impulse past, gave a loose to mirth, sang 2 or 3 amorous songs with more heart than art, and fell into every frantic disorder which unbridled, genuine joy is. But so far was he from any disposition to quarrel, that he was 10 times better humoured, if possible, than when he was sober. His was a drunkenness of celebration, not of conflict, To say truth, nothing is more erroneous than the common observation that men who are ill-natured and quarrelsome when they are drunk are very worthy persons when they are sober for drink. In reality, doth not reverse nature or create passions in men which did not exist in them before. It simply takes away the guard of reason, the careful censor of our souls, and consequently forces us to produce those symptoms which many, when sober, have art enough to conceal. It heightens and inflames our passions, generally indeed that passion which is uppermost in our mind, so that the angry temper, the amorous, the generous, the good-humored, the avaricious, and all other dispositions of men are in their cups, not created, but merely heightened and exposed for all to see. And yet, as no nation produces so many drunken quarrels, especially among the lower people, as England, for indeed with them to drink and to fight together are almost synonymous terms, I would not, methinks, have it thence concluded that the rest too aft, English, are the worst-natured people alive. Perhaps the love of glory only is at the bottom of this, so that the fair conclusion seems to be that our countrymen have more of that love and more of bravery than any other plebeians, and this the rather as there is seldom anything ungenerous, unfair, or ill-natured exercised on these occasions. Nay, it is common for the combatants to express goodwill for each other, even at the time of the conflict. And as their drunken mirth generally ends in a battle, so do most of their battles end in friendship. But to return to our history, though Jones had shown no design of giving offense, yet Mr. Blifil was highly offended at a behavior which was so inconsistent with the sober and prudent reserve of his own temper. He bore it too with the greater impatience, as it appeared to him very indecent at this season, when, as he said with icy reproof, the house was a house of mourning on the account of my dear mother, and if it had pleased heaven to give him some prospect of Mr. Allworthy's recovery, it would become them better to express the exultations of their hearts in thanksgiving than in drunkenness and riots, which were properer methods to increase the divine wrath than to avert it. Thwackum, who had swallowed more liquor than Jones, but without any ill effect on his brain, seconded the pious harangue of Blifil, but square, for reasons which the reader may probably guess, namely, his own recent financial gain from the very man being celebrated, was totally silent, finding philosophy in his pipe. Wine had not so totally overpowered Jones as to prevent his recollecting Mr. Blifil's loss the moment it was mentioned. As no person, therefore, was more ready to confess and condemn his own errors, he offered to shake Mr. Blifil by the hand and begged his pardon, saying his excessive joy for Mr. Allworthy's recovery had driven every other thought out of his mind. It was a genuine, if inebriated, apology. Blifil scornfully rejected his hand, a gesture of utter contempt, and with much indignation answered, it was little to be wondered at if tragical spectacles made no impression on the blind, but for his part, he had the misfortune to know who his parents were, and consequently must be affected with their loss. It was the most cruel cut he could deliver, a deliberate strike at the most sensitive part of Jones's identity. Jones, who notwithstanding his good humor, had some mixture of the irascible in his constitution, a spark that could be fanned into flame leaped hastily from his chair, and catching hold of Blifil's collar, cried out, "DNU for a rascal! Do you insult me with the misfortune of my birth?" He accompanied these words with such rough actions that they soon got the better of Mr. Blifil's peaceful temper, which was but a thin veneer over a core of spite, and a scuffle immediately ensued, which might have produced real mischief had it not been prevented by the interposition of Thwackum and the physician, for the philosophy of Square rendered him superior to all such vulgar emotions, and he very calmly smoked his pipe, as was his custom in all broils, unless when he apprehended some immediate danger of having it broke in his mouth. The combatants, being now prevented from executing present vengeance on each other, betook themselves to the common resources of disappointed rage, and vented their wrath in mutual threats and defiance. In this kind of conflict, fortune, which in the personal attack seemed to incline to the stronger Jones, was now altogether as favorable to his more articulate enemy. A truce, nevertheless, was at length agreed on by the mediation of the neutral parties, and the whole company again sat down at the table, where Jones being prevailed on to ask pardon and Blifil to give it a cold and brittle peace was restored, and everything seemed on the surface in statu quo. But though the quarrel was in all appearance perfectly reconciled, the good humour which had been interrupted by it was by no means restored. All merriment was now at an end, suffocated by the formalities of the forced peace, and the subsequent discourse consisted only of grave relations of matters of fact, and of as grave observations upon them, a species of conversation in which, though there is much of dignity and instruction, there is but little entertainment for the heart. As we presume, therefore, to convey only this last to the reader, we shall pass by whatever was said, till the rest of the company, having by degrees dropped off, left only Square and the physician together, at which time the conversation was a little heightened by some comments on what had happened between the two young gentlemen, both of whom the doctor declared to be no better than scoundrels, to which appellation the philosopher, very sagaciously shaking his head, agreed, finding it easier to judge others than to examine his own conscience. Jones retired from the company, still agitated from the heated confrontation and the lingering effects of wine, into the open fields. He intended to cool his fevered temper and clear his head with a vigorous walk in the open air before he attended Mr. Allworthy's chamber. There, whilst he renewed those tender, aching meditations on his dear Sophia, which the dangerous illness of his friend and benefactor had for some time rightfully interrupted, an accident happened which with sorrow we relate, and with sorrow doubtless will it be read. However, that historic truth to which we profess so inviolable an attachment obliges us to communicate it to posterity, however damaging it may be to the momentary reputation of our hero. It was now a pleasant evening in the latter end of June, when the world was clothed in its most verdant and generous attire. Our hero was walking in a most delicious grove, a sanctuary of nature, where the gentle breezes played a soft symphony by fanning the leaves together with the sweet trilling of a murmuring stream and the melodious, heart-piercing notes of nightingales, formed all together the most enchanting harmony designed by nature itself. In this scene, so sweetly accommodated to love and tender reflection, he meditated solely on his dear Sophia, while his wanton fancy roamed unbounded over all her beauties, her eyes, her voice, the grace of her movement, and his lively imagination painted the charming maid in various ravishing forms. His warm heart melted with unbearable tenderness, and at length, overwhelmed by the intensity of his own feelings, throwing himself on the ground by the side of a gently murmuring brook that seemed to echo the flow of his thoughts, he broke forth into the following passionate ejaculation: "Oh, Sophia, would heaven give thee to my arms? How blessed, how supremely blessed would be my condition. Cursed be that fortune which sets a distance between us, a chasm wider than any ocean. Was I but possessed of thee, and you had but one only suit of rags, as thy whole estate, is there a man on earth whom I would envy? How contemptible would the brightest Circassian beauty, dressed in all the jewels of the Indies, appear to my eyes. But why do I mention another woman? Could I think my eyes capable of looking at any other with tenderness, these very hands should tear them from my head. No, my Sophia, if cruel fortune separates us, forever my soul shall dote on thee alone. The chastest constancy will I ever preserve to thy image. Though I should never have possession of thy charming person, still shalt thou alone have possession of my thoughts, my love, my soul. Oh, my fond heart is so wrapped in that tender bosom that the brightest beauties would for me have no charms, nor would a hermit be colder in their embraces. Sophia, Sophia alone shall be mine. What raptures are in that name! I will engrave it on every tree." He was in this moment the very picture of a devoted, hopeless lover. At these words filled with passionate resolve, he started up and beheld, not his Sophia, no, nor a Circassian maid, richly and elegantly attired for the grand signor's seraglio. No, he saw a figure from a past life, a stark contrast to his celestial visions, without a gown in a shift that was somewhat of the coarsest linen and none of the cleanest, bedewed likewise with some odoriferous effluvia of honest sweat, the produce of the day's labor in the fields, with a pitchfork in her hand. Molly Seagrim approached. Her hair was tousled, her cheeks flushed with sun and toil, and she stood before him as a living emblem of the earthly world he had just been rhetorically forsaking. Our hero had his penknife in his hand, which he had drawn for the before-mentioned purpose of carving his beloved's name on the bark, when the girl coming near him cried out with a knowing, ironic smile, "You don't intend to kill me, squire, I hope. Why should you think I would kill you?" answered Jones, startled from his romantic trance. "Nay," replied she, her smile turning sharper. "After your cruel usage of me, when I saw you last killing me, would perhaps be too great kindness for me to expect." Here ensued a parley, a conversation of low, urgent tones and significant looks, which, as I do not think myself obliged to relate its particulars, I shall omit. It is sufficient that it lasted a full quarter of an hour, at the conclusion of which they retired into the thickest part of the grove, where the leaves provided a curtain, and the murmuring brook a discreet soundtrack to folly. Some of my readers may be inclined to think this event unnatural, a violent contradiction to the high sentiment he had just professed. However, the fact is true, and perhaps may be sufficiently accounted for by suggesting that Jones probably thought one woman better than none, and Molly as probably imagined two men to be better than one. Besides the before-mentioned motive assigned to the present behavior of Jones, the reader will be likewise pleased to recollect, in his favor, that he was not at this time perfect master of that wonderful power of reason which so well enables grave and wise men to subdue their unruly passions, and to decline any of these prohibited amusements. Wine now had totally subdued this power in Jones. He was, indeed, in a condition in which, if reason had dared to interpose, though only to advise, she might have received the answer which one Cleostratus gave many years ago to a silly fellow who asked him if he was not ashamed to be drunk. "Are not you," said Cleostratus, "ashamed to admonish a drunken man? To say the truth in a court of justice, drunkenness must not be an excuse. Yet, in a court of conscience, it is greatly so, and therefore Aristotle, who commends the laws of Pittacus, by which drunken men receive double punishment for their crimes, allows there is more of policy than justice in that law. Now, if there are any transgressions pardonable from drunkenness, they are certainly such as Mr. Jones was at present guilty of, on which head I could pour forth a vast profusion of learning if I imagined it would either entertain my reader or teach him anything more than he knows already. For his sake, therefore, I shall keep my learning to myself and return to my history. The twists of fate in this story are both tragic and compelling. If you're eager to see how Jones's moment of weakness will unravel his life, make sure to subscribe for the next chapter. It hath been observed that fortune seldom doth things by halves. To say truth, there is no end to her freaks whenever she is disposed to gratify or displease. She is a capricious queen who enjoys setting up her dominoes only to watch them fall in the most inconvenient sequence. No sooner had our hero retired with his dido into the leafy bower, but the scene was set for a discovery of the most damaging kind. As the poet might say, "Spellencum Blifil dux et divinus eandem deveniunt." The leader Blifil and the divine man Thwackum come to the same cave. The parson and the young squire, who were taking a serious and morally superior walk, arrived at the stile which leads into the grove, and the latter, with eyes sharpened by malice and opportunity, caught a view of the lovers just as they were, sinking out of sight behind the dense foliage. Blifil knew Jones very well. His figure and gait were unmistakable, even though he was at above 100 yards distance, and he was as positive to the sex of his companion, though not to the individual person. The sight was enough. He started as if stung, blessed himself in a perfunctory manner, and uttered a very solemn ejaculation, a prayer of pious horror that was entirely for show. Thwackum expressed some surprise at these sudden emotions, and asked the reason of them, to which Blifil answered with a well-practiced tone of grave concern. He was certain he had seen a fellow and wench retire together among the bushes, which he doubted not was with some wicked purpose. As to the name of Jones, he thought proper to conceal it, and why he did so must be left to the judgment of the sagacious reader. For we never choose to assign motives to the actions of men when there is any possibility of our being mistaken. Perhaps he wished the discovery to be more public, or perhaps he wanted to savor the moment of revelation himself. The parson, who was not only strictly chaste in his own person, but a great enemy to the opposite vice in all others, was instantly fired with righteous zeal at this information. He desired Mr. Blifil to conduct him immediately to the place which, as he approached, he breathed forth vengeance, mixed with lamentations for the state of sinfulness he was about to confront. Nor did he refrain from casting some oblique reflections on Mr. Allworthy, insinuating that the wickedness of the country was principally owing to the encouragement he had given to vice by having exerted such misplaced kindness to a bastard, and by having mitigated that just and wholesome rigour of the law which allots a very severe punishment to loose wenches. His indignation was a physical force rustling the leaves as he strode. The hypocrisy of Blifil and Thwackum knows no bounds. What do you think their true motives are? Let us know in the comments. The way through which our holy hunters were to pass in pursuit of their moral game was so beset with briars and tangled undergrowth that it greatly obstructed their walk, and caused, besides such a constant rustling, that Jones had sufficient warning of their arrival before they could surprise him. Nay, indeed, so incapable was Thwackum of concealing his indignation, and such loud vengeance did he mutter forth with every heavy step he took, that this alone must have abundantly satisfied Jones that he was to use the language of sportsmen found sitting. The trap sprung by his own weakness was about to close around him, and the consequences would echo far beyond that secluded grove, as in the season of rutting an uncouth phrase by which the vulgar denote that gentle dalliance which in the well-wooded forest of Hampshire passes between lovers of the fairine kind, if while the lofty crested stag meditates the amorous sport, a couple of puppies or any other beasts of hostile note should wander so near the temple of Venus Farina that the fair hind should shrink from the place, touched with that somewhat either of fear or frolic, of nicety or skittishness, with which nature hath bedecked all females, or hath at least instructed them how to put it on, lest through the indelicacy of males the Samian mysteries should be pried into by unhallowed eyes. For at the celebration of these rites, the female priestess cries out with her in Virgil, who was then probably hard at work on such celebration. Procul o procul este profani, proclamat, vates totoque, absistait luco, far hence be souls profane, the Sibyl cried, and from the grove abstain. Dryden, if I say, while these sacred rites which are in common to genus omne animantium are in agitation between the stag and his mistress, any hostile beasts should venture too near, on the first hint given by the frighted hind, fierce and tremendous, rushes forth the stag to the entrance of the thicket. There stands he sentinel over his love, stamps the ground with his foot and with his horns, brandished aloft in air, proudly provokes the apprehended foe to combat. Thus, and more terrible to human eyes, when he perceived the enemy's approach, leaped forth our hero from his own leafy bower. Many a determined step advanced he forwards in order to conceal the trembling hind behind him, and if possible, to secure her retreat from this unseemly exposure. And now Thwackum, having first darted some livid lightning from his fiery, indignant eyes, began to thunder forth in a voice that shook the very leaves, "Fie upon it, Mr. Jones! Is it possible you should be the person? His tone was one of profound, almost theatrical disappointment. You see, answered Jones with a defiant calmness that belied his racing heart. It is possible I should be here. And who said, Thwackum, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss, is that wicked slut with you? He peered past Jones, trying to pierce the shadows of the thicket. If I have any wicked slut with me, cries Jones, his protectiveness flaring into anger. It is possible. I shall not let you know who she is. He stood his ground, a human wall between accusation and its target. I command you to tell me immediately, says Thwackum, drawing upon the last vestiges of his former authority. And I would not have you imagine, young man, that your age, though it hath somewhat abridged the purpose of tuition, hath totally taken away the authority of the master. The relation of the master and scholar is indelible, as indeed all other relations are, for they all derive their original from heaven. I would have you think yourself, therefore, as much obliged to obey me now as when I taught you your first rudiments. It was a plea to a hierarchy Jones no longer recognized. I believe you would cry, as Jones, a wry, bitter smile touching his lips. But that will not happen unless you had the same birchen argument to convince me. He was recalling the rod of Thwackum's past discipline and challenging it directly. Then, I must tell you plainly, said Thwackum, his patience snapping. I am resolved to discover the wicked wretch, and I must tell you plainly, returned Jones, his voice low and firm. As iron I am resolved, you shall not. Thwackum then offered to advance a bull, charging a gate, and Jones laid hold of his arms, which Mr. Bliffle immediately endeavored to rescue, declaring with a hypocrite's zeal he would not see his old master insulted. It was the pretext he needed to join the fray. Jones, now finding himself engaged with two adversaries, thought it necessary to rid himself of one of his antagonists as soon as possible. He therefore applied to the weakest first, and letting the parson go, he directed a swift, sharp blow at the young squire's breast, which, luckily taking place, reduced him to measure his length on the ground with a most satisfying thud. It was not a noble act, but in the economy of a brawl, a practical one. Thwackum was so single-mindedly intent on the discovery, on dragging the sin into the light, that the moment he found himself at liberty, he stepped forward directly into the fern without any great consideration of what might, in the meantime, befall his prostrate friend. But he had advanced a very few paces into the thicket before Jones, having swiftly defeated Bliffle, overtook the parson and dragged him backward by the skirt of his coat, like a man pulling a stubborn dog from a fight. This parson, however, had been a notable champion in his youth, and had won much honor by his fist, both at school and at the university. He had now, indeed, for a great number of years, declined the practice of that noble art, yet was his courage full as strong as his faith and his body, though softened by a life of scholarship and good living, no less strong than either. He was, moreover, as the reader may perhaps have conceived, somewhat irascible in his nature. When he looked back, therefore, and saw his friend and ally, Bliffle stretched out on the ground, and found himself at the same time so roughly handled by one who had formerly been only passive in all conflicts between them, a circumstance which highly aggravated the whole insult. His patience at length gave way entirely. He threw himself into a posture of offense, a remembered stance from his pugilistic past, and collecting all his force, attacked Jones in the front with as much impetuosity as he had formerly attacked him in the rear with a birch rod. Our hero received the enemy's attack with the most undaunted intrepidity, and his bosom resounded with the solid blow. This he presently returned with no less violence, aiming likewise at the parson's breast. But Thwackum dexterously drove down the fist of Jones so that it reached only his belly, where 2 pounds of beef and as many of pudding were then deposited, and whence, consequently, no hollow sound could proceed, only a dense and padded thump. Many lusty blows, much more pleasant, as well as easy to have seen than to read or describe, were given on both sides. At last a violent fall, in which Jones had thrown his knees into Thwackham's breast, so weakened the latter that victory had been no longer dubious, had not Blifil, who had now recovered his wind and his strength, again renewed the fight, and by engaging with Jones, given the parson a precious moment's time to shake his ears and to regain his labored breath, and now both together attacked our hero, whose blows did not retain that formidable force with which they had fallen. At first so weakened was he by his exhausting combat with the surprisingly robust Thwackum, for though the pedagogue chose rather to play solos on the human instrument, and had been lately used to those only, yet he still retained enough of his ancient knowledge to perform his part very well in a duet. The odds were turning, and the victory, according to modern custom, was like to be decided not by valor but by numbers. The tension in this scene is almost unbearable. Who are you rooting for in this brutal showdown? Let us know in the comments, when, on a sudden, a fourth pair of fists appeared in the battle and immediately paid their hearty compliments to the parson, and the owner of them, at the same time crying out with a voice that was music to Jones's ears, "Are not you ashamed, and be deedent to you to fall 2 of you upon one?" It was the roar of a familiar lion. The battle, which was of the kind that for distinction's sake is called royal, now raged with the utmost violence during a few minutes, till Blifil, being a second time laid sprawling by a desperate swing from Jones Thwackum, condescended to apply for quarter to his new antagonist, who was now found to be Mr. Western himself, for in the heat of the action and the dim light of the grove, none of the combatants had recognized him. In fact, that honest squire, happening in his afternoon's walk with some company to pass through the field where the bloody battle was fought, and having concluded from seeing 3 men engaged that 2 of them must be on a side, he hastened from his companions, and with more gallantry than policy espoused the cause of the weaker party, by which generous if impulsive proceeding he very probably prevented Mr. Jones from becoming a victim to the united wrath of Thwackum and to the pious friendship which Blifil bore his old master. For besides the disadvantage of such odds, Jones had not yet sufficiently recovered the former strength of his broken arm. This timely reinforcement, however, soon put an end to the action, and Jones, with his unlikely ally, obtained the victory, leaving the forces of piety and hypocrisy scattered on the field. The remainder of Mr. Western's company now arrived upon the scene, reaching the grove at the precise instant when the furious action had concluded, like latecomers to a play who miss the drama but witness the aftermath. These were the honest clergymen whom we have formerly seen offering sober counsel at Mr. Western's table, Mrs. Western, the sophisticated and formidable aunt of Sophia, and lastly the lovely Sophia herself, whose entrance would now transform the nature of the conflict entirely. At this time the following was the aspect of the bloody field, a tableau of comic tragedy. In one place lay on the ground, all pale and almost breathless, the vanquished Blifil, looking every bit the martyred saint. Near him stood the conqueror, Jones, his shirt torn his face, a mask of grim determination, almost covered with blood, part of which was naturally his own, and part had been lately the property of the Reverend Mr. Thwackum, a crimson testament to their close quarters combat. In a third place stood the said Thwackum, like King Porus after his defeat, sullenly and grudgingly submitting to the conqueror, his pride wounded more deeply than his body. The last figure in the piece was Western the Great, standing with his chest puffed out most gloriously and magnanimously, forbearing the vanquished foe, a picture of rustic chivalry. Blifil, in whom there was little sign of life beyond a pathetic moan, was at first the principal object of the concern of every one, and particularly of Mrs. Western, who, with the brisk efficiency of a society matron, had drawn from her pocket a slender bottle of hartshorn, and was herself about to apply it to his nostrils, when, on a sudden, the attention of the whole company was diverted from poor Blifil, whose spirit, if it had any such design, might have now taken an excellent opportunity of stealing off to the other world without any ceremony or further interruption. For now a more melancholy and a far more lovely object lay motionless before them, capturing every gaze. This was no other than the charming Sophia herself, who, whether from the sight of blood or from a sudden gripping fear for her father's safety in the melee, or from some other reason known only to her delicate constitution, had fallen down in a dead swoon before anyone could get to her assistance. She was a fallen angel amidst the brambles. Mrs. Western first saw her and let out a piercing scream that cut through the grove. Immediately, 2 or 3 voices cried out in panicked unison, "Miss Western is dead." Hartshorn, water, every remedy was called for, almost at one and the same instant, creating a cacophony of helpless alarm. The reader may remember that in our description of this grove, we mentioned a murmuring brook, which brook did not come there, as such gentle streams flow through vulgar romances with no other purpose than to murmur poetically and set a scene. No fortune, in her whimsical design, had decreed to ennoble this little brook with a higher honor than any of those which wash the plains of Arcadia ever deserved. It was to be an instrument of salvation. Jones was half-heartedly rubbing Blifil's temples, for he began to fear he had given him a blow too much, when the words "Miss Western and dead" rushed at once on his ear with the force of a physical blow. He started up, as if electrified, left Blifil to his own fate without a second thought, and flew to Sophia, while all the rest were running against each other backward and forward in a comical display of confusion, looking for water in the dry paths. He alone acted. He caught her up in his arms, a vision of limp grace, and then ran away with her over the field to the rivulet above mentioned, where, plunging himself into the water, he contrived to besprinkle her face, head, and neck very plentifully with the cold reviving stream. Happy was it for Sophia that the same confusion which prevented her other friends from serving her prevented them likewise from obstructing Jones in his desperate rescue. He had carried her half-ways across the field before they knew what he was doing, and he had actually restored her to life before they reached the waterside. She stretched out her arms, opened her eyes, and cried, "Oh heavens," in a soft, bewildered voice, just as her father, aunt, and the parson came panting up a belated audience to the miracle. Jones, who had hitherto held this lovely burthen in his arms, now reluctantly relinquished his hold, but gave her, at the same instant, a tender, involuntary caress. A brush of his hand, so fleeting and full of feeling that had her senses been then perfectly restored, it could not have escaped her observation. As she expressed therefore no displeasure at this intimate freedom, we must suppose she was not sufficiently recovered from her swoon at the time to register it, though the memory of it would surely linger in her heart. This tragical scene was now converted into a sudden scene of joy and profound relief. In this our hero was certainly the principal character, for as he probably felt more ecstatic delight in having saved Sophia than she herself received from being saved, so neither were the congratulations paid to her equal to what were conferred on Jones, especially by Mr. Western himself, who, after having once or twice embraced his daughter with a rough, heartfelt squeeze, fell to hugging and kissing Jones with a bear-like affection. He called him the preserver of Sophia, and declared there was nothing except her or his entire estate which he would not give him. But upon a moment's recollection, he afterwards accepted his prized foxhounds, the Chevalier and Miss Slouch, for so he called his favourite mare. It was the highest compliment the squire could conceive. All fears for Sophia being now removed, Jones became the sole object of the squire's boisterous consideration. "Come, my lad," says Western, "doff thy coat, and wash thy face, for at in a devilish pickle I promise thee. Come, come wash thyself, and shat go womb with me, and we'll see to find thee another quote." His dialect was thick with emotion and goodwill. Jones immediately complied, threw off his bloody coat, went down to the water, and washed both his face and bosom, for the latter was as much exposed and as bloody as the former. But though the clear, cool water could clear off the red stains, it could not remove the black and blue marks, the livid badges of honor which Thwackum had imprinted on both his face and breast. These bruises being discerned by Sophia, as she regained her full senses, drew from her a sigh and a look full of such inexpressible tenderness that it spoke more than 1,000 sonnets. The silent language of looks between Jones and Sophia says more than words ever could. Are you as captivated by their story as we are? Share this chapter with a fellow romance lover. Jones received this tender glance full in his eyes, and it had infinitely a stronger effect on him than all the contusions he had received from Thwackum, an effect, however, widely different, for so soft and balmy was it that had all his former blows been mortal stabs, it would for some minutes have prevented his feeling their smart. It was a healing unguent for his soul. The company now moved backwards as one, and soon arrived at the spot where Thwackum had with some effort got Mr. Blifil again on his legs, though the young man leaned heavily and theatrically on his mentor. Here we cannot suppress a pious wish that all quarrels were to be decided by those weapons only with which nature, knowing what is proper for us, hath supplied us, and that cold iron was to be used in digging no bowels but those of the earth. Then would war, the pastime of monarchs, be almost inoffensive, and battles between great armies might be fought at the particular desire of several ladies of quality, who, together with the kings themselves, might be actual spectators of the conflict. Then might the field be this moment well strewed with human carcasses, and the next, the dead men, or infinitely the greatest part of them, might get up like Mr. Bayes's troops in the farce, and march off either at the same fiddle as should be previously agreed on. I would avoid, if possible, treating this matter ludicrously, lest grave men and politicians, whom I know to be offended at a jest, may cry pish at it. But in reality, might not a battle be as well decided by the greater number of broken heads, bloody noses, and black eyes, as by the greater heaps of mangled and murdered human bodies? Might not towns be contended for in the same manner? Indeed, this may be thought too detrimental a scheme to the French interest, since they would thus lose the advantage they have over other nations in the superiority of their engineers. But when I consider the gallantry and generosity of that people, I am persuaded they would never decline putting themselves upon a par with their adversary, or, as the phrase is, making themselves his match. But such reformations are rather to be wished than hoped for. I shall content myself, therefore, with this short hint and return to my narrative. Western, his curiosity now piqued, began to inquire into the original rise of this quarrel, to which neither Blifil nor Jones gave any answer, each for his own reasons, maintaining a stubborn silence. But Thwackum said surlily, "I believe the cause is not far off. If you beat the bushes well, you may find her." "Find her," replied Western, his eyes lighting up with understanding. "What, have you been fighting for a wench?" "Ask the gentleman in his waistcoat there," said Thwackum with a nasty glance at Jones. "He best knows." "Nay," then cries Western, slapping his thigh, "it is a wench, certainly. Ah, Tom, thou art a liquorish dog. But come, gentlemen, be all friends, and go home with me and make final peace over a bottle." He saw nothing amiss in a scuffle over a woman. To him, it was the most natural thing in the world. "I ask your pardon, sir," says Thwackum, drawing himself up with injured dignity. "It is no such slight matter for a man of my character to be thus injuriously treated and buffeted by a boy, only because I would have done my duty in endeavoring to detect and bring to justice a wanton harlot. But indeed, the principal fault lies in Mr. Allworthy and yourself, for if you put the laws in execution as you ought to do, you will soon rid the country of these vermin." His voice was a sermon of condemnation. "I would as soon rid the country of foxes," cries Western, dismissing the moralizing with a wave of his hand. "I think we ought to encourage the recruiting those numbers which we are every day losing in the war. But where is she? Prithee, Tom, show me." He then began to beat about the bushes in the same language and in the very same manner as if he had been beating for a hare, and at last cried out with hunter's instinct, "Soho puss is not far off. Here's her form upon my soul. I believe I may cry stole away." And indeed so he might, for he had now discovered the place whence the poor girl had at the beginning of the fray stolen away upon as many feet as a hare generally uses in travelling, leaving nothing but a crushed impression in the ferns. The contrast between Thwackum's puritanical wrath and Western's boisterous practicality could not be sharper. Who do you find more insufferable? Debate it in the comments. Sophia, now thoroughly embarrassed and weary to her very soul, desired her father to return home, saying she found herself very faint and apprehended a relapse. The squire immediately complied with his daughter's request, for he was at his core the fondest of parents. He earnestly endeavoured to prevail with the whole company to go and sup with him, but Blifil and Thwackum absolutely refused, the former saying, with a meaningful look, that there were more reasons than he could then mention why he must decline this honour, and the latter declaring, perhaps rightly, that it was not proper for a person of his function to be seen at any place in his present dishevelled and bloodied condition. Jones, however, was incapable of refusing the pleasure of being with his Sophia, the magnetic pull of her presence outweighing all fatigue and pain. So on he marched, with Squire Western and his ladies the parson bringing up the rear. This good clergyman had indeed offered to tarry with his brother Thwackum, professing his regard for the cloth, would not permit him to depart. But Thwackum in his foul mood would not accept the favour, and with no great civility pushed him after Mr. Western, wanting no company but his own grievances. Thus ended this bloody fray, and thus shall end the 5th book of this history, leaving our hero bruised in body, but uplifted in spirit, his secret discovered by his enemies, but his worth revealed to the woman he loves. Thus, dear reader, we draw the curtain on this history of a foundling, a tale that has traversed the turbulent landscape of human passion, from the lowest haunts of vice to the most refined salons of virtue and back again. We have witnessed the machinations of hypocrisy in the forms of Thwackum and Square, the venomous envy of Blifil, the boisterous humanity of Squire Western, and the serene benevolence of the great Mr. Allworthy. But at the heart of this vast and varied tapestry, we have followed the fortunes of Tom Jones, a soul composed of fiery spirits and a heart of gold, whose innate goodness was perpetually at war with the indiscretions of his youth and the gold impetuosity of his temper. His journey, though often misguided, was ever guided by a fundamental love of virtue and a boundless capacity for feeling. He loved too readily, trusted too easily, and fought too passionately. But these very faults sprang from the excess of qualities which, properly tempered, constitute the finest of men. In Sophia Western he found not only the object of his most ardent and constant affections, but also his true moral compass. Her love, her purity, and her unwavering esteem provided the polish for the diamond rough within him. And what of the others? The wheels of fortune, which had seemed so capricious, ultimately turned with a justice that was both poetic and profound. The scheming Blifil, his deceit, laid bare before the resurrected wisdom of Mr. Allworthy, was justly disinherited and cast out his legacy one of shame and exile. The philosophers Thwackum and Square, their self-righteous masks torn away, retreated into the obscurity their hollow doctrines deserved. Squire Western, after much bluster and resistance, was ultimately conquered by his daughter's happiness, his love for her proving stronger than his ambition for a grand alliance. The final reconciliation in the hall of Mr. Allworthy's estate was not merely a union of two lovers, but the healing of a family. Allworthy, with tears of joy, embraced Jones not as a wayward ward, but as a true son and heir, the rightful recipient of his name and fortune. In this moment, the foundling was found, his identity and his destiny secured not by the accident of his birth, but by the consistent, if flawed, testimony of his heart. And so, as Tom Jones and the incomparable Sophia were at last united in a marriage founded on the deepest mutual affection and hard-won constancy, we are reminded that while virtue may sometimes slumber and vice may temporarily triumph, the final disposition of Providence is a moral one. Happiness is not the prize of the perfectly prudent, but the rightful inheritance of the truly good-hearted, who through error and experience learn to govern their passions with principle. Let us therefore close this volume with the satisfaction that in the grand comedy of life, the laughter ultimately rings true, and the bells of happiness peal loudest for those who, like our hero, possess the courage to feel deeply, to err greatly, and to love with an undivided heart.